Chapter 2283. After Zhang Yan returned to the Qinghuan Palace, he continued to meditate. Recently, with the rapid expansion of the Yan sect, his understanding of the Tao behind the creation spirit far surpassed those of his peers. As long as the Yan sect did not perish, he could continue to maintain this advantage. Even though someone was targeting the Yan sect now and had drawn over the powers of the myriad of worlds in the universe to besiege the Yan sect, it was still limited within the main world. So long as it wasn't a god-rank refinement cultivator that directly interfered, then he would naturally not interfere. Presently, there wasn't a single person amongst all the existences that dared to act in this way. Although Gao Qingtu had asked for the imperial edict several times, the clone he left in the present world did not respond. Although the tide was vast, the Yan sect's main altar had a strand of his Weili, so it could not be breached even at the most critical moment. Moreover, the Yan sect's many altars were stationed in the place where spiritual opportunity was extinct. The sects were only chasing after spiritual opportunity to vent their anger, but not many would go to those barren places, so there was nothing to worry about. At this moment, he glanced at the void crack. Although everyone had been blocking the arrival of the Weili behind the power of robbery, what would come would eventually come. This could only obstruct it for a while. When the returning power had accumulated enough, if they still insisted on obstructing it, then it would be a confrontation between the two parties. Not only would this not obstruct the returning person, but it would also further expand the void crack, so he had to stop no matter what. He made a mental calculation. From the looks of it, this interception could still last for another 100 years. However, it was hard to say if the spirit of creation would come along, but he had to be prepared for its arrival. Therefore, in these 100 years, he needed to improve his fighting strength as much as possible. Previously, he was able to observe the Tao of emptiness. Although this method could not be combined, but the great Tao returning to one was not without inspiration. However, this was only a long-term benefit and was not helpful in the short term. Therefore, he still needed to return to the owner of the demonic treasury, the Pauline that might exist. Now that he had a better grasp of this Tao method, if he could find another Pauline, his strength would increase a little. Since the owner of the demonic treasury was at least a great virtue, he had been trying to find a way to follow those clues to find Pauline. After a few attempts, he already had a good idea of what was going on and believed that he could already use a method to pursue the past. He turned his thoughts and entered the divine decree. Then, he began to look at his past memories. In an instant, countless images flowed past his eyes like flowing water. In next to no time, his gaze descended onto a scene, and then he stepped into it. The surrounding scenery changed. Yin Qi surged in all directions, and it was incomparably dark and gloomy. The demonic treasury was floating in the air. This was the underworld river under the 9 continents, and it was the place where he first saw it. He stared at it for a moment, then recalled the past. In reality, the Devil Trove and the 9 subjugation Devil Slip were still in his hands. He didn't choose to look at them directly. Instead, he took a detour and entered his memories. That was because if he didn't do so, he might alert the owner of the Devil Trove. That person was definitely not in the silence right now, but his Weili might respond spontaneously and sever the connection. His own divine decree was already separated by a layer, but he could still deceive it. As he traced back, he soon saw a bearded Taoist who had found this place and claimed the demonic treasury for himself. This person was Lu Gu, and this scene happened when he found the item just now. He looked at it indifferently and continued to trace back. Before Lu Gu got the Devil Trove, it had a few owners. However, they were all very far apart in time. These people's fates were all similar. Because they couldn't suppress their greed, they unscrupulously devoured others. In the end, they were all besieged and killed. The scene in his eyes went from the Donghua continent to the South Cliff continent, then to the Middle Pillar continent, and finally to the 3 western continents. In the past, the 3 western continents weren't as dilapidated as they were later. Instead, it was when Lu Yuqingqua, the divine border on earth, and the sects of the western continent were at their peak. He couldn't help but look at the mountains, rivers, and land, as well as the many sections. However, at this time, the scene in front of him shook slightly. Obviously, at this time, there was already a grand whaley immersed here. He didn't look too much. The 9 continents were originally in the realm of what could be seen and what could not be seen. This place was also within the divine decree. If he forced himself to look, there might be some twists and turns for no reason. He didn't come for this, so there was no need to cause unnecessary trouble. He just stared at the devil trove and continued to trace back to its source to see where it came from. As he continued to look, he suddenly saw a ray of dim light fall into the world. He suddenly looked up and saw a dark mysterious void cave outside the sky world. It's here. With a thought, he appeared in front of the mysterious void cave. However, he stopped there and didn't continue forward. At this moment, he could feel that there was a whaley inside. If he just barged in like this, he might alarm it and cause what he saw to collapse on its own. However, the problem here wasn't difficult to solve. Before doing this, he had already considered all the possible situations he might encounter. He stretched out a finger and formed a body of strength that was formed according to the will of the owner of the devil trove. He attached his thought to it and drove it inside. As expected, he didn't encounter any obstacles and smoothly walked inside. There was only a black-clothed Taoist sitting there. The Taoist looked at him indifferently and said, "Since Taoist has formed his own Tao, we have nothing to do with each other. Why did you come here?" Zhang Yan understood that this person wasn't the owner of the devil trove. It was just a strand of whaley. He smiled and said, "I'm here to ask for something." The Taoist said, "What?" Zhang Yan said, "Fellow Taoist, the lotus of good fortune in your hands." The Taoist pondered deeply for a moment before he said, "Fine, I've stopped using this treasure a long time ago. If fellow Taoist needs it, then take it." As soon as he finished speaking, he just flicked his sleeve, and a lotus floated up before him. Zhang Yan wasn't surprised that he was so cooperative. Even if he didn't give it to him, with the clues he found, he could still find it. He stretched out his hand and let the Pauline stay on his palm. Since he had already obtained it, he didn't have the mood to chat with the whaley. With a thought, he had already retreated from the divine decree. He looked down and saw that the Pauline was still in his hand. However, after a few glances, he found a trace of abnormality. He had seen many creation Pauline now, but the Pauline he had come into contact with before all gave him a feeling that they had a deep connection with the owner. However, the Pauline that the owner of the devil trove gave him was different. It seemed that she had been estranged from the owner for a long time and had almost no connection with the owner. He couldn't help but have some thoughts about this. He used to think that every Vedanta must have creation Pauline, but now it seemed that it wasn't the case. It seemed that Timing Patriarch and the other 3 patriarchs didn't rely on this to achieve their achievements, or maybe they abandoned it after achieving it. The reason why they did so, he guessed that it might be for the sake of pure Tao. It was like the spirit of creation swallowed all kinds of Tao, and the Vedanta were actually like what he thought before, constantly improving on their own Tao, and then covering all kinds of Tao. The more superior they were, the more they were unique. Pauline's item, in fact, also had a Tao in it. In order to not let their Tao be contaminated by external Taos, it was normal to abandon it. However, this matter did not affect him in the slightest. The reason he was searching for the lotus was so that he could control a part of the great Tao for his strength Tao body. This did not interfere with his Qi Tao body. Moreover, cultivating both Qi and strength meant that he did not need to walk the path of the pure Tao. However, this matter didn't have much to do with the matter at hand, so he threw it aside, collected his mind, and began to deduce the Tao. Previously, he had obtained a lot of Pauline's Qi activity, but this was a complete Pauline, so this time it was very smooth, and when he was done deciphering it, this Tao division technique had advanced to another level. He thought, "Come down and wait for the 2 fellow Taoists to come." He collected his thoughts, and went into a meditative state. His previous deduction was very accurate. When it was close to 100 years, the whaley in the gap of the void surged violently, and when Fengdu and the others noticed it, they did as he said and didn't forcibly stop it, and all of them withdrew their own power, letting the two Whaley that had been lingering in the power of robbery for a long time fall into the all-being. If everything went smoothly, another two Vedanta would return. However, at this moment, Zhang Yan suddenly felt something, and when he looked up, he saw a pair of eyes in the void looking at him, but it was immediately withdrawn. His eyes narrowed, and he pondered for a while, feeling that the situation had changed, and he couldn't wait for the two people to come, so he spread out his divine will, and in an instant, bumped into the two Vedanta that hadn't returned. Before the two figures walked out of the void, the Whaley had already felt his divine will, and when it sensed that there was no hostility, it accepted it. Zhang Yan entered the divine will, and saw two Taoists with blurry faces and ethereal bodies standing there. He knew that this was only the visualization of the two Whaley, so whether it was their memory or mana, they were both lacking, but it didn't hinder him from communicating with them, so he cupped his hands and said, "Greetings, my two Taoists." The two people returned the greeting, and said, "My two Taoists, why are you looking for me so urgently?" Zhang Yan said, "Just now, I noticed that although the two of you have returned, the situation is different this time. The original body of the spirit of creation is very likely to follow the two of you and fall into the Vedanta. In order to fight against it, I need to borrow the chi of the two creation Pauline." The two of them weren't complete, but they could still judge the pros and cons, especially when it came to the spirit of creation. If Zhang Yan asked for the complete Pauline now, perhaps they might consider it. After all, just now, they had to accept the Whaley's calamity power, but if it was just borrowing a wisp of chi, they didn't think it was a big deal. The two of them immediately summoned the Pauline in their divine will, plucked a wisp of chi, and sent it out. Zhang Yan received the two wisps of chi, and without saying anything, he cupped his hands and returned to his divine will. Then, he opened his palms, and the two wisps of Pauline chi were already floating in front of him. Chapter 2284. With a thought, Zhang Yan's Pauline's aura appeared in front of him. Apart from the one he originally had, the others were obtained from ancestor Yao Han, the lord of the devil treasury, the purple-robed Taoist, Ji Zhuang, Xiang Zhu, Heng Wu, Wei Ming, Feng Du, Ying Kong, and Xiang Ming. That made a total of 11. In addition to the two that he obtained from the two Taoists just now, he now had a total of 13 auras. However, at this moment, when these auras were revealed, there was a change within. First, the Pauline's aura from the purple-robed Taoist moved and combined with the one that he obtained just now. Then, the Pauline's aura from ancestor Yao Han floated out and combined with the remaining one. In the blink of an eye, the 13 auras became 11. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed, but he didn't show any surprise. He muttered, "So it is." After refining the Pauline's aura from the Lord of the Devil Treasury, he felt that his understanding of Taoism had reached the final juncture. He was only one step away from gathering all of Pauline's aura. The current situation made him even more certain that there were a total of 12 treasured lotuses, and he was only missing one in order to make it complete. However, it seemed that there was something wrong with the two returned Taoists. One of them might be related to ancestor Yao Han. Thinking about the Taoist's divine ability that person left behind in Yuxiao school, it wasn't strange. The other Pauline's aura came from the same place as the purple-robed Taoist's aura. It was possible that he was borrowing it. As for why this person was still willing to give him Pauline's aura, one possibility was that he didn't care, and the other was that he didn't know that he had been taken by the creation spirit. Of course, these could also be wrong. There were too few clues for him to make an accurate judgment. However, he did not need to pay attention to this matter. As long as he was strong enough, he could deal with any changes calmly. It wasn't that the two converged chi activities didn't bring him any gains, but they were much fuller than before, imperceptibly allowing him to deepen his possession of the Tao art behind him. But that was all. Only by obtaining the last Pauline would he be able to truly possess this Tao art. As for the lesser imperfection treasured lotus, he could roughly guess who possessed it. However, this person was hidden very deeply, and he had no connection with this person. Since this person's Whaley incarnation was not here, even if he had the intention, he would not be able to find him. For the time being, there was no other way but to continue waiting. He collected his thoughts and retreated from the divine decree. But right at this moment, he felt that everything was different from before. The myriad of stars that were flickering like stars that were ceaselessly being born and destroyed seemed to have been suppressed by some sort of force, and they gradually fell into a state of stagnation. It was an extremely oppressive chi activity. Not only did it make it difficult for the Whaley to circulate, but it also seemed to have been obstructed by something. His gaze suddenly became sharp. Just now, before the arrival of the two Taoists, he had already sensed the unusual movements in the void desolation crack. In his heart, he deduced that the true body of the spirit of creation was very likely to take advantage of the situation to come here. Looking at the current situation, this guess was probably going to come true. Sure enough, the crack in the void desolation crack was not blocked by the calamity power because of the arrival of the two Vedanta. Instead, an incomparably terrifying force was spreading out. On the other side, Fengdu, Xiangjue, Yingkong, and the others were looking at the crack. The so-called crack actually only existed in everyone's senses. But now, there was actually an additional bottomless hole that seemed to want to swallow them. Immediately, they understood that the true body of the spirit of creation would soon follow this crack and fall into the void desolation crack. As soon as this thought appeared in their minds, a great fear surged uncontrollably from the bottom of their hearts. This was not because their minds and cultivation were not strong enough, but because their wily bodies were automatically giving off warning signs, reminding them to do everything possible to stay away from that force. But in their hearts, they knew that this was absolutely impossible to avoid. Suddenly, there was a flash in the hole, and then a beam of brilliance shone down. A Taoist wrapped in endless spiritual light appeared in the void desolation crack. The arrival of this person did not cause any commotion. At this moment, the void desolation crack seemed to have frozen, as if only this person was just now the only living thing. This Taoist just existed there, but there were countless Taoist techniques circulating around his body. Just the pressure of the Whaley he emitted was enough to shatter the two great virtues who had returned to the void desolation crack but had yet to completely walk out from the void desolation crack. Xiangjue and the others were all standing in the field. Pauline had already been summoned, but they felt that they could not move at all. The Whaley that was everywhere around them filled every gap, like insects wrapped in amber, firmly binding them in place. Not only was the Whaley forced into the range of their bodies, they could not even use their own divine wills. They had been forcibly separated from the void desolation crack. If it were not for creation Pauline by their side, they might have already been banished into eternal silence. The Taoist surrounded by spiritual light walked forward. The closest to him was Wei Ming, but as the Whaley pressed closer, the lotus petals on creation Pauline's body fell off one by one. Then, the Taoist himself shattered like the most fragile glass. Xiangjue, who was slightly further away, followed in his footsteps. As the Taoist walked forward, Heng Wu, Ji Zhuang, Yingkong, Xiang Ming, and the others all saw their Pauline shatter one by one. Although they had great abilities, they could not resist this person at all. Of the returning great virtues, only Hong Do was still standing there, staring at the Taoist. However, the Taoist did not stop beside him. He walked past him and headed straight for Bushutian. Cracks appeared on Fengdu's body, and they quickly spread to every corner. Then, like pieces of porcelain, they fell off and soon became incomplete. However, he let out a cold snort and forcibly stood there. He did not collapse like the others, but it was clear that he could no longer attack. The Taoist quickly arrived before Bushutian. He stretched out his palm and slowly pressed toward the place where the greatest creation essence was. His movements looked extremely slow, but they were wrapped in countless Whaley. After the Taoist appeared, Zhang Yan's gaze was fixed on him. His eyes were deep and his sleeves fluttered in the wind. At this moment, his energy and strength were pushed to the peak. He stepped out of Bushutian and stretched out two fingers to touch the palm. Boom! Two indescribable forces collided with each other. Countless profound Tao techniques rotated and alternated here, and they collided and fused ceaselessly. However, not a single bit of them leaked out, and they were completely withstood by themselves. However, at this moment, the Taoist's movements slightly stiffened. Then, the light around his body gradually dimmed and returned to nothingness. Zhang Yan seemed to have sensed something and looked up. He saw a few Taoists with blurry silhouettes, each holding a spell and sitting in a different position. The mighty force of the spirit of creation was twisting and swaying in the encirclement. But after a moment, the scene disappeared. Just now, it was undoubtedly the true body of the spirit of creation. However, this person should have been trapped and only managed to leak a trace of power into the realm of everything. Then, it was sealed back by the great virtue Weili that was still inside the tribulation power. After the Taoist disappeared, the Weili also disappeared. The great virtue Weili in the nothingness gathered again. Just now, the people who had collapsed once again walked out from the nothingness. However, their expressions were extremely ugly. When facing that Taoist, they could be said to be powerless to fight back. If he stayed for a moment longer, they might not be able to return to the realm of everything. They could not help but look at Zhang Yan with a trace of reverence in the depths of their eyes. The latter had exchanged a blow with the spirit of creation, yet he was completely unharmed. They had personally experienced the supreme Weili conflict, so they naturally knew how powerful it was. Even though they had said that they wanted to fight against the true body of the spirit of creation, they were actually pessimistic in their hearts. They had once thought that perhaps when it came, everything would be destroyed, their Taoist techniques would be seized, and they would be banished into eternal silence. However, this time, Zhang Yan's action of fighting it head-on gave them some hope. Thus, they raised their hands and bowed to him from afar, but they solemnly cupped their fists. If this bow was said to be purely out of etiquette in the past, now it was because they were sincerely convinced. At this moment, Zhang Yan had his sleeves behind his back. He looked up at the crack in the distance and seemed to be thinking about something. No one dared to disturb him, and they only waited quietly at the side. Just now, Zhang Yan could be said to have collided head-on with the spirit of creation. At that moment, he also saw many things that he did not know in the past. This time, the spirit of creation might not have broken through the tribulation power only because of himself. Perhaps the Vedanta who restrained this person also wanted to use him to tell him something. He retracted his thoughts and swept his gaze across everyone's faces. He slowly said, "The true body of the spirit of creation was only locked for a moment, and its power has already dissipated. With the power within the tribulation power, it will not be able to hold it for long. Not long after, it will probably fall into the realm of everything. We need a countermeasure." Hong Do cupped his fists and said, "Fellow Taoist Xianyuan, we will do what you say." Everyone nodded in agreement. Zhang Yan said, "I want to see the Taoist techniques of everything, is that okay?" Hong Do was the first to stand up and said without hesitation, "Of course." The rest of the people discussed for a while in the divine will, but they all agreed with this statement. Although the Taoist techniques of every Vedanta were profound and mysterious, and if they were seen by others, they would no longer be able to defeat the other party. If it was before the true body of the spirit of creation arrived, they would not be willing to do so. But now, it was different. After realizing the terror of the spirit of creation, they knew that even if they guarded their Taoist techniques, it would be useless. This person was only Weili, and could scatter them. The spirit of creation wanted to swallow them up, and Zhang Yan was also a Vedanta like them. Even if he saw it, he would not be able to do so. Xiang Ju stood up and cupped his fists. He said, "Fellow Taoist, if you think that our Taoist techniques can help fight against the spirit of creation, why would we hide ourselves and willingly offer our Taoist techniques to you?" Chapter 2285. In the past, Zhang Yan only knew that the true body of the spirit of creation was amazing. As for what kind of strength this person had, he could only roughly estimate it before he met it and was unable to make an accurate judgment. Just now, after exchanging blows with it, he was able to directly see his opponent's strength. However, although it was the true body of the spirit of creation, because it was trapped, its power couldn't be fully released. If it returned, its power would definitely be stronger. The spirit of creation and the Vedanta couldn't coexist. Either the Vedanta swallowed the Vedanta, or the Vedanta killed it. To defeat such an opponent, he needed even stronger power. Be it the spirit of creation or the Vedanta, they all wanted to obtain the Tao that they were missing to reach the end realm. The path of the spirit of creation was very clear. As long as it swallowed all the Vedanta, then it would naturally be complete. On the other hand, although Dada had created the spirit of creation and caused the essence of creation to shatter, he had also opened up the great Tao that the essence of creation had originally protected. As long as one was able to find it, they would be able to make up for the final flaw. Even though he was trying to take over the Tao behind the spirit of creation, he was still far from success. He couldn't solve the crisis in front of him. Just now, when he clashed with the spirit of creation, his strength actually played a huge role. If he didn't have the body of strength to rely on, he might not have been able to block it so easily. However, he didn't know where the last creation Pauline was. There was also no hope for this Tao, so he could only think of a way on the Qi Tao. Observing everyone's Tao was his current strategy. At this moment, after experiencing what happened just now, Hongdu was the most decisive in his actions. He displayed his Weili, and after separating himself from the others, he displayed all the mysteries of his Tao and allowed Zhang Yan to observe. Zhang Yan didn't observe it closely on the spot. Instead, he projected it into his spirit will. He bowed and said, "Thank you for trusting me." Hongdu said, "You're too kind. As long as it's against the spirit of creation, my Tao is nothing." Xiang Ju took a step forward and said, "Fellow Taoist, my Tao art is here." With a thought, he spread out his divine will and operated it, displaying the various transformations of the Tao technique. Compared to Fengdu, he and the others were slightly more conservative. Although no one besides Zhang Yan could go against the spirit of creation, they were still instinctively on guard against the spirit of creation. They were deeply afraid that their Tao arts would be seen through, so they decided to display their Tao arts within the divine decree. Zhang Yan was about to return to Bu Su Tian when Xiang Ju asked, "Fellow Taoist Xianyuan, should we continue with the Weili?" This time, when the true body of the spirit of creation appeared and everyone collapsed, there was no one to suppress the purple-robed Taoist. It was Zhang Yan who used the mighty power of several lands of creation to continue suppressing him within, which prevented him from escaping. Although the operation of the spirit of creation did not stop because of this, it was greatly affected. First, the Weili of the spirit of creation had spread further, and it was even worse than when the Taoists' Weili split was destroyed. Zhang Yan said, "Continue." Although this could not solve the crisis, it could reduce the impact on many realms. Xiang Ju said, "I understand." Seeing that there was nothing else, Zhang Yan bid farewell to the others and returned to Bu Su Tian. He sat in meditation and sorted out what he had learned this time. The Dharma of the great virtues all belonged to the Qi Tao, and the great virtues all controlled a part of the great Tao. Therefore, although the Dharma of the great virtues was different, their roots were still the same. Being able to observe them this time was extremely enlightening for him to improve his Qi Tao body. His Qi Tao's fundamental Dharma was the Taixian true technique, which contained infinite changes and was unpredictable. It could be said that he could see all kinds of Dharma, but this did not mean that he could accommodate all Dharma. It was just that there was not much difficulty in understanding and deducing them. He deduced that the Taixian founding master and the others had put aside the creation Pauline and purely cultivated their own Dharma. However, he did not think that the founding masters could do this right from the start. There must have been a process of merging and resisting with the other Dharma, and then rejecting and abandoning them. Therefore, all of this should be built on the basis of familiarity with the Dharma of the great virtues. This was not difficult to achieve, as one could understand the Dharma by just discussing the Dharma or fighting. However, this was only so. The profoundness of the Dharma was the secret of every great virtue. It was related to the foundation of each great virtue, and under normal circumstances, outsiders would not be able to know about it. Moreover, because everyone's Dharma was cultivated wholeheartedly and had their own imprints, it was destined that only the creation spirit could devour it. Peers could only learn from it and could not steal it. Even if they could do it, they could not do it better than the original master of the Dharma. However, just because others could not do it, it did not mean that he could not do it. After observing the Dharma of Inkong, he had an idea. He could use the remnant jade to return the Dharma he had seen to the beginning, and he could deduce it from the beginning. This way, he could change the Tao of the other party into his own Tao. If he could deduce all the Dharma and master it, then he would definitely be able to greatly improve his Dharma. Originally, he only had this idea and did not think that it could actually be done. However, he did not expect that the creation spirit's real body would make it so easy to achieve. However, it was a pity that the two Vedanta who were supposed to return did not appear. It was unknown whether they were forced into eternal silence by the spirit of creation, or if their mighty power was too scattered and could not gather for a while, thus turning from nothingness into existence. If these two could return, then he might be able to see the Dharma behind them as well. Thinking about this, he thought of something. This time, the creation spirit entered Zhu Yu with a clear goal. It went straight for Bu Su Tian and did not devour anyone else. This action was worth pondering. He guessed that devouring the great virtues was not a simple matter, so he did not have time to do it. If this was really the case, then he might be able to make use of it. At this time, Xiang Ju and the others returned to the world created by everyone and continued to suppress the purple-clothed Taoist. Although they knew that if a creation spirit were to be born into the world and obtain a piece of Yuan jade, they would instantly gain the mighty power of the true body. Earlier, they merely maintained vigilance and didn't place such a threat at the top of their list. However, after the unexpected event from before, they didn't dare to be careless in the slightest, and they used all their attention to deal with this matter. However, everyone quickly noticed that something was off. Originally, with the purple-clothed Taoist's Weili as a guide, it should not be difficult to pull out the Weili that were of the same origin. However, not only could this not be done, there were signs that the person was being devoured. This meant that there was more mighty power scattered outside than the purple-robed Taoist, and there was a spiritual connection. From the looks of it, it was either another creation spirit's mighty power incarnation that had appeared in the world, or he had entrusted his mighty power to a creation spirit who had descended into the world. The few of them felt that this was not a small matter and did not dare to make a decision on their own. They used their spiritual will to look for Zhang Yan and told him the truth. Zhang Yan said, "I'll have to trouble everyone to look after this person. I'll take a look at him." He made up his mind and released the Weili to check among the world. If the other party was a Weili's incarnation, then he was in the world. Even if he was hiding now, there would be traces left behind. However, he speculated that the other party was not likely to do so because the target was too big and could be found with some effort. Moreover, through his observation, although this force did affect the purple-clothed Taoist, it was only suppressing the weak and did not have much initiative. This was proof. After some investigation, the truth was as he expected. There was no other Weili's incarnation in the world. After eliminating this possibility, there was only one possibility left. The Weili's incarnation was placed on the body of a creation spirit. With a spiritual connection, it would not be scattered. If the person existed in the world, then it would be easy to identify it. Therefore, it was very likely that it landed in an unknown place. He thought for a while and said to everyone, "You guys just need to calm the purple-clothed Taoist first. I'll solve the matter of the Weili as soon as possible." Zhu Dade was now very trusting of him. Hearing him say this, they were relieved and went to do their work. Zhang Yan also withdrew from his spiritual will. He thought for a while and said to the formation spirit, "Please invite Dan Yi here." Dan Yi quickly arrived at the Qinghuan Palace. After greeting, he sat on the seat and said, "Just now, I see that the qi activity in the outside world is stagnant, and there is a call ringing in my ears. My mana is also moving. Is there a change in the creation spirit?" Zhang Yan nodded and said, "Your guess is correct. The creation spirit has entered the world for a moment." He briefly explained the situation just now and said, "I invited you here because I feel that perhaps only you can follow the Weili and find the place where the incarnation is placed." After hearing the reason, Dan Yi's expression became serious and he said, "I'm duty-bound to find the incarnation." Zhang Yan said, "The sooner the better." "I'll have to trouble you." Dan Yi nodded solemnly. He pondered for a while and said, "Just now, after hearing what you said, I have something I don't understand. I wonder if I can ask." Zhang Yan said, "Please speak, fellow Taoist." Dan Yi said, "Since the missing Tao exists in the world, and this Tao might be the key for you Day to restrain this person, why didn't the creation spirit just overturn it? Wouldn't that be giving you an opportunity instead?" Zhang Yan smiled and said, "There's a reason for this. This person is also lacking in this Tao. If the world were to be destroyed, it wouldn't be his wish. Moreover, if the Tao reached a certain level, all the Weili would be placed on him. He didn't even need the creation spirit Pauline, so how could he not control his own Weili and overturn the world? In fact, there was another reason that he didn't say. The creation spirit's original body didn't destroy the world. Apart from the above reasons, perhaps it was like the Dade who sealed him, he also made some kind of arrangement. Both sides could be said to have used their own methods. In the beginning, they should be playing chess and waiting for the end to come to see which side was more brilliant. Dan Yi's doubts were cleared and he took his leave. After he left, Zhang Yan sank his mind into the broken jade and started to deduce the Tao of the Dade from the beginning. Chapter 2286. When the spirit of creation fell into the world, it had a great impact on the millions of worlds. It was the same for Bushutian. If not for Zhang Yan's Weili, those who were fated to enter the Tao would have long since regarded him as the only Tao master. Although things did not develop that way, the spiritual opportunity in the heavens had been further damaged. Although it had not reached the point where spiritual opportunity had been cut off, it was not far from it. The sects in the heavens had experienced the cutting off of their Tao. They were afraid that spiritual opportunity would no longer exist, so the conflict between the heavens became more apparent. Now, except for a few sects who were guarding their bases, most of the forces were constantly fighting for spiritual opportunity. It could be said that the fighting was getting more and more intense. For example, the mountain and sea realm and Qinghua heaven were inevitably targeted because of their abundance of spiritual opportunity. However, the remnants of the Mirror Lake had failed in their attack on the mountain and sea realm, which made people realize how powerful it was. Few people came here to cause trouble. The Qinghua heaven, on the other hand, suffered a lot of impact, but it was quickly suppressed by the Green Jade Palace. The spirit of creation's Tao had spread everywhere, allowing many people to easily enter the Tao. However, the various forces were too busy to care about themselves, so they did not have the time to care about these things. Even the extraterrestrial demons had no time to gloat, because it was the same in the anti-heaven and earth. Even unknown things were difficult to use. Here, the Yen sect was the only exception. Over the years, after resolving the unfavorable situation, the Yen sect had taken the initiative to remove many of the altars that were built in places with abundant spiritual opportunity and moved them elsewhere. This not only avoided conflict with the sects, but also did not want to be involved in disputes. In any case, the disciples of the Yen sect did not need spiritual opportunity to cultivate. There were countless worlds that could be used by them. Now that even the demons and other worldlings were weakened due to the decline of spiritual opportunity, it was more convenient for them to open up a new world. In the Yen sect's headquarters, Gao Qingtu looked at the distribution of the Yen sect's forces on the heavenly star chart inside. If one day, the Yen sect's teachings are passed down in all the worlds, then my wish will be fulfilled. Tang Yu was startled and said, "Teacher, is it not the Tao that you seek?" Gao Qingtu smiled. The Tao that the patriarch spoke of is the Tao, and the Yen sect's wish is also the Tao patriarch's wish. This wish has no conflict with the Tao. He pointed up. If we want to go one step further, we will need the Yuan Jade. But it is still up to the patriarch to decide if we want it or not. Tang Yu lowered his head and thought for a while, then said, "If the spiritual vigor continues to fade away like this, it's very likely that there will be a day when it's completely cut off. At that time, my Yen sect will definitely become the only great sect in the heavens. Teacher, I believe your wish will come true very soon." "It is not that easy," Gao Gao shook. "Of Yen of Tao. Gao Yen God will be. Tao will of the sect. Tao of Yen of Tao. Tao is. Of, E said. Gao of Tian of Dao, of sect was to of Yen of. With of people. Was. Had Dao sect for sect. He was cautious. First, he searched in Bushu heaven. After confirming that there was nothing he missed, he started to search outside. Zhang Yan believed that since Zhu Beid and himself were unable to find the target, it was most likely because the target had fallen into an unknown land. Thus, even if his mighty power was comparable to the spirit of creation, he still wouldn't be able to find the target. Unless that person who was related to the spirit of creation came to a realization, found the origin jade, and transmigrated to the upper realm, only then would everyone be able to sense it. Dan Yi was also the spirit of creation. Others could not find the target. But he had a high chance of finding the target. He was not like the clone of the spirit of creation, the Weili, who could easily disperse the Weili to the unknown place. So after cultivating for a long time, just now, he found a wisp of spiritual light. Then, he sent his consciousness into it. However, as soon as he sank into this space, he realized that apart from his own great power, there was no other great power of the same Tao. It gave him a feeling of being lost. In other words, he could still sense the existence of everything. However, he did not know where he was. It was like a mortal suddenly being in the middle of a boundless ocean. It was difficult for him to tell where he was. Not only that, he had to be extra careful. Once his consciousness was lost, he might not be able to return to his real body. He calmed himself down a little, and then he continued to search for the source of the mysterious force. However, it was not as smooth this time. The mighty force was like countless threads, leading to countless places, and it was difficult to tell where the person that was connected to the spirit connection had landed. He sighed in his heart. It is not so simple. If he could communicate with Zhang Yan's divine will at this moment, then he would be able to rely on the latter's power to find the person who entrusted the mighty power. However, under the obstruction of the boundless mighty power of the spirit of creation, his senses could only be described as a blur. His mind was also a little muddled, and his divine will was unable to connect with others. He heard Zhang Yan's description and knew the danger of the Weili clone of the spirit of creation. Not only was it the biggest hidden danger in the void, it was also very likely to be a help to the real body after it returned. So, no matter how difficult it was, he had to find it. He roused his spirit and tried his best to identify the real target. After all, he was one with the spirit of creation. After a long time, he finally found a suspicious place. But right at this moment, he seemed to have sensed something. Turning his head to look, he discovered that there was a person walking side by side with him, and that person's appearance was exactly the same as his. The person shook his head and said, "Fellow Taoist, you can't go, you can't go. Who knows if this is a trap? If you go, you will lose your Tao." Dan Yi calmed his mind and said seriously, "You're wrong. My Tao is firm and I will not be confused. Why should I be afraid of external forces?" This was both to strengthen his Tao heart and to give the other person an answer. As soon as he spoke, the person disappeared immediately as if it was just his imagination. He thought about it and understood a little. As the body of the spirit of creation, he had a heart realm. However, he had been cultivating his Tao for a long time, so his heart realm was obedient. This place was filled with the Weili of the spirit of creation, so it caused his heart realm to be unstable. Fortunately, he stood firm and only believed in his Tao. Just now, he did not waver at all. Otherwise, it was very likely that he would be led astray and fall into the Tao of the spirit of creation. However, with this disturbance, the clue that he sensed just now was broken and he could only search from the beginning. However, the Taoist did not really disappear. In this place filled with the Weili of the spirit of creation, there were no other places that were invaded by the great virtue Weili. That person would appear in his senses from time to time and give out bewitching words to persuade him to abandon himself and follow the Tao. He was helpless about this. As long as he continued to release his divine will to find that person, the Weili of the spirit of creation would follow and invade his mind and will. Unless he gave up and retreated from this place, this matter would definitely follow him for the rest of his life. This was undoubtedly a test for him. Feeling that it was not appropriate to continue like this, he immediately changed his strategy. He followed the guidance of a certain whaley and sank into a more suspicious present world. Moreover, he immediately sealed his mind and temporarily isolated himself from the invasion. He sized up the place where he landed. As expected, this was a place of creation. However, although the whaley of the spirit of creation filled this place, it did not invade it. Because once he did so, he would immediately be exposed to the silence. Similarly, because of the obstruction of the whaley, he had no way to occupy it. Instead, he had to try his best not to touch it to prevent the previous situation from happening again. He pondered for a while and created countless clones that entered the various worlds in this present world. He hoped to find the person that the whaley had entrusted himself to. After Zhang Yan's mind sank into the remnant jade, he deduced all the Tao techniques that he had seen. The deduction here was actually to cultivate the Tao techniques that he had obtained from the beginning to the end. He wanted to truly transform it into his own and fuse it into his own Tao technique. However, in order to prevent a situation where he gained too much in a short period of time, it would cause his own whaley to be out of harmony. So, every time he completely grasped a person's Tao technique, he would withdraw from the remnant jade and harmonize the vital energy in his body before choosing the next Tao technique. At the beginning, he didn't feel it very obvious. But as he progressed, his mind became clearer, and his comprehension towards the grand Tao grew deeper and deeper. When he finished deducing the last person's Tao technique, 5 rays of light suddenly blazed behind him. The brilliance was like smoke and gas, and there was an immortal tune drifting about. Unknowingly, his Tao technique was improving ceaselessly, and it seemed to have no signs of stopping. At this moment, he had a change of thought and thought to himself. Even though my Tao technique has improved greatly, I wonder if I'll be able to suppress the spirit of creation's true body. When he thought up to here, he turned his consciousness and tried to recreate the battle he had with the spirit of creation on that day. Moreover, he wanted to find out the profundities of the spirit of creation's Tao technique. However, just now, when he deduced the spirit of creation's Tao technique slightly, he saw its figure appear along with it, and he instantly felt a sense of danger in his heart, so he dispersed it without the slightest hesitation. At this moment, he already understood that as long as the image of the spirit of creation appeared, it would be as if the person had truly returned to everything. In fact, if it was someone else, even if they wanted to deduce it in their consciousness, they wouldn't be able to reflect the image of the spirit of creation at all. This was because the difference in strength between the two parties was too great. Even if they forcefully visualized it, it would only cause them to collapse first. However, he was different from them. Not only was his whaley powerful, but he also had the body of strength to rely on. If he continued to deduce it just now, he would really be able to reappear the true body of the spirit of creation. Once the matter developed to this point, the great virtues within the tribulation power might not be able to seal it back. Fortunately, he was already on guard and didn't give them any opportunity to take advantage of. However, if he couldn't get out of here, then he wouldn't need to use his God's decree. He could just use the remnant of the jade to calculate. However, at this moment, he suddenly thought of something and didn't retreat. Instead, he summoned the Taoist that was formed from the remnant of his consciousness. As his Tao technique cultivation had greatly improved, other than the Taoist's face which was still blurry, the figure had become much clearer, as if more of its original form had been restored. The Taoist bowed to him and asked, "Fellow Taoist, are you looking for me for something?" Zhang Yan nodded and said, "I would like to see the Tao technique behind the Tao technique, is that possible?" The Taoist said in a deep voice, "Fellow Taoist has already obtained my Tao technique." Chapter 2287. Zhang Yan listened to the Taoist's words and was deep in thought. Apart from the Taoist techniques that he had just obtained, the only techniques he had were Qi and Strength Taoist techniques. Strength techniques were obtained from the owner of the Devil's Treasury. However, he had seen the owner of the Devil's Treasury, Whaley, who was different from this person. Therefore, it could only be Qi techniques. This Tao art was first deduced by him from the 5 directions 5 elements Taishian true light. However, if one looked closely, it turned out that the technique was actually just a rather powerful technique. Therefore, he used the 9 sutras passed down by the great underworld ancestral master to deduce it again and derived a superior technique from it. Since then, he had been perfecting this technique in his cultivation. The technique that the other person mentioned should be this technique. Not mentioning the other person's true identity, the problem was that his Tao technique was merely borrowed from the 5 Elements Sutra. The two were actually not the same thing and could not be discussed together. He thought for a while and said, I have heard of the ancient Taishian sect. However, looking at the universe, in the past and future, other than Qingjue Mountain, which is similar to the orthodoxy, there has never been such a Tao technique. I wonder if you have any connection with it. The Taoist thought for a while and said, Qingjue Mountain was only passed down by a strand of my will to enter the world. The so-called Taishian sect should only be established by the people of the world after obtaining my technique. It can be said that there is, but it can also be said that there is no such thing. At this point, he said, do you know why you can see my remnant will and even gather my appearance? Zhang Yan said, fellow Taoist, are you trying to say that our cultivation techniques are similar? The Taoist said, exactly. I have no connection with you, but I can feel that our Tao techniques are indeed similar. If not for that, I wouldn't have been able to enter your consciousness. Zhang Yan shook his head and said, I don't think so. The Taoist said, what do you think? Zhang Yan said in a serious tone, my cultivation method was developed by myself. It is not from the same source as what fellow Taoist taught me. However, there are thousands of variations in Tao techniques. Even if it is not fellow Taoist, I can still accept it. Furthermore, after the essence of creation was broken, I am the only one who has achieved the highest cultivation method. If fellow Taoist does not choose me, who will you choose? The Taoist pondered and said, what fellow Taoist said makes sense, but my intuition should not be wrong. It is unnecessary for fellow Taoist to observe my Tao technique. Zhang Yan, whether it's unnecessary or not is up to me to decide. After pausing for a moment, he looked over and said, fellow Taoist, you once said that the spirit of creation borrowed your body, and even you can't believe it. However, if fellow Taoist is willing to show your Tao to me, then even if you really did borrow my body, I can still control you. In that case, the other minor details don't matter. When the Taoist heard him say this, he was startled. After a while, he said, since fellow Taoist said so, I am willing to fulfill your wish. However, my body is not complete, and the Tao technique I show is not necessarily complete. Fellow Taoist needs to be careful and not be greedy. Zhang Yan replied, of course I know that. I have my own plans on how to choose. When the Taoist heard him say this, he did not say anything more and displayed his Tao technique. Zhang Yan looked at it and found that it was as the Taoist said. Because his body was incomplete, his Tao technique was scattered and not a whole. Fortunately, his cultivation in Tao technique was very high. Even if it was not a complete Tao technique, he could still see many things from it. With a little deduction, he could restore some of its original appearance. This time, he needed to understand this person's Tao. Increasing his own strength was one of the things he needed to do, and the other was to fix the Tao slightly. If he reflected the will of this Taoist, he might be able to find some of the power back. Being Weili and having memories were actually the same thing. How much power one had was how much memory one had. For example, Fengdu, Xiangjue, and the others, their memories were still a little lacking, which meant that their power was not complete. Zhang Yan could feel that this Taoist seemed to know a lot of things. Then, when his Weili returned, he might be able to find out some unknown things from the Taoist's mouth. Therefore, he spent some time to perfect this Tao technique. Then, he tried to reflect the Tao technique. However, there was an accident here. Every time he tried to do so, not only did the Taoist's figure not reform, it collapsed. He tried again and again, but the result was the same. His first reaction was, could it be that this person had been seized by the spirit of creation? so he couldn't reflect it. However, he immediately felt that something was wrong. This person's will was damaged. Even if the Tao technique was seized by the spirit of creation, it had already been separated from it. Therefore, there was only one reason left, and that was that this person was unwilling to return. Zhang Yan thought about what happened before and understood. No wonder this person had the intention to evade when he asked about the Tao technique just now. At first, he thought that this person didn't want him to see his Tao technique. Now, it seemed that it was because he deduced that he might be able to gather the Tao technique, so he didn't want himself to be completely reflected. Seeing this, he did not continue to force it. Instead, he gathered his thoughts like before and summoned the Taoist's broken body once more. He said, "Fellow Taoist, is your loss due to the spirit of creation?" The Taoist shook his head and said, "Perhaps so. I only have a vague feeling, but it might not be real. Instead of making fellow misjudge, it's better not to say it." Zhang Yan said, "It's fine. Even if it's fake, it has its true appearance. Whether it's right or wrong, I will judge it myself." The Taoist said, "Since fellow insists on asking, then there's no need for me to hide." He didn't say anything else. Instead, he displayed all the things that he couldn't prove to be true or false. After reading it, Zhang Yan nodded and didn't ask any more questions. He directly withdrew from the divine will. After colliding with the spirit of creation, he saw many things and understood many things. He wouldn't immediately believe this information just because it was passed on to him by a great virtue. Although their positions against the spirit of creation were the same, it didn't mean that there was no competition between the great virtues. Moreover, no one knew how much the spirit of creation would affect the great virtues within the tribulation power. He wouldn't blindly follow it, so he needed more clues to make a comparison. He sorted out the things that were hard to determine and sorted out some clues. Regardless of whether these were real or fake, as long as he was prepared in both aspects, he wouldn't panic when the time came. Dan Yi's consciousness was still immersed in those unknown places. He had already searched several times, but he still couldn't find the person tied to the spirit. He couldn't help but wonder if it was because of those Weili that he was led astray. He also began to worry, afraid that it would be difficult to find any results if he continued to search like this. However, he had a solution in his heart that wasn't really a solution. Since he was of the same origin as the spirit of creation and was still a spirit refinement cultivator, if he took the initiative to absorb the Weili and obey the Tao, then the spirit of creation Weili would definitely be transferred from the person who entrusted it to him. As long as he entered this Tao, Zhang Yan would definitely be able to find him. As long as he could drive him into eternal silence, then the spirit of creation Weili would be wiped out in one fell swoop. From the bottom of his heart, he was willing to do this. However, his only worry was that he would be controlled by the Weili and be helpless. If he really did this, it might not be as he thought, which also put him in a dilemma. After weighing the pros and cons for a while, he decided to try again. If it really didn't work out, then it wouldn't be too late to take this Tao. In Buxu Heaven, Qing Sheng, Shenchang, Zhan Yuan, and other spirit refinement cultivators gathered together. Previously, when Zhang Yan and the spirit of creation Weili collided, they also sensed a little. The boundless Weili made their bodies stiffen and their divine wills freeze just by looking at it. After this incident, every single one of them saw a Tao art within their own divine wills, and after they deduced it in detail, they noticed that this Tao art was peerlessly profound and seemed as if it was made for them. If they cultivated according to this Tao art, then it would obviously be able to assist them to improve, and they would at least be able to attain the level that Zhang Yan had attained in the past. However, after everyone discussed with each other, they realized that this Tao technique was not unique to them, but everyone had seen it. Naturally, they were a little more cautious. Taoist Shinchang suggested, "This Tao technique is strange. If we really want to cultivate it, we might as well ask fellow Taoist Xianyuan first, in case we fall into a trap." No one objected to this, so they came to the Qinghuan Palace to look for Zhang Yan. Zhang Yan was deducing the Tao technique, so he came out with his clone. After knowing about this, he said, "Everyone, please let me have a look at this Tao technique." No one hesitated, and they all displayed their Tao techniques. Zhang Yan glanced at them, and he immediately knew what was going on. As expected, this Tao technique was indeed related to the spirit of creation, but it also had something to do with him. Previously, when the true body of the spirit of creation Weili fell, it almost repelled all the great virtues within the Zhuyu, Ru Xiang Ju and the others were almost banished into eternal silence. Logically speaking, Shenchang, Qingsheng, and the others' cultivation was far inferior, so it should be the same. However, the difference here was that they hid in Buxu heaven, so they were protected by Zhang Yan's Weili and survived. Originally, deity ascension cultivators were able to gain insights from the collision of the Weili, and this generation was lucky to survive, and they also saw a superior Tao technique, so they unknowingly peeped into these Tao techniques. However, this was not obtained by themselves, so there was a sense of separation from themselves, as if it was passed on to them by someone else. Zhang Yan thought for a while, even if they obtained this Tao technique, they would not be able to cultivate to the state of great virtues, because without the creation Pauline, they would not be able to settle the Zhuyu, and in the end, they would not be able to achieve anything. However, cultivating Tao was after all their own business. Moreover, with the current situation, the true body of the spirit of creation would probably fall back to the Zhuyu in no time, and by then, he might not be able to protect everyone. If everyone wanted to try, he would not stop them. Thus, he said, I have seen this Tao technique, and there is no hindrance. It is an evolution of your own Tao technique, and everyone here can cultivate it. However, it is not easy to pass the barrier, and if you do not have something to rely on, it is almost impossible to pass, so you must be cautious. As soon as this was said, people like Yuan Fang, Bing Kong, and the others immediately retreated. They were people who cultivated external techniques, and without the fragments of creation or the land of creation, the Tao technique would be useless, no matter how good it was. Moreover, it was not that they could not hear the danger in this. Shenchang and Zhai Yuan could not make up their minds, but only Qingsheng was not willing to stay in the current state, and wanted to give it a try. He said, Fellow Taoist, what is the name of the thing that you are talking about? I wonder where can we find it? Zhang Yan did not say it clearly, but said, You will know when the time comes. Everyone, please go back. As soon as he said this, everyone felt dazed, and they were shocked to find that in an instant, they were back in the cave. Chapter 2288. Zhang Yan opened his eyes. After obtaining all the great virtue Tao techniques in the void, he repeatedly deduced the changes of the spirit of creation's Tao technique in the remnant jade. Although this wasn't a true battle, he was already confident in his heart. If the spirit of creation's true body appeared before him again, and it was still at the same level of strength as before, then it was extremely likely that he would be able to defeat it. However, deduction was only deduction in the end. What he saw last time wasn't the full strength of the spirit of creation, so he didn't think that he could easily suppress this opponent. He circulated the Weili slightly, and the 5 lights behind him flickered. Within the void, practically all the spirit of creation's Weili that could be sensed by everyone were eliminated by him. However, there were still many Weili scattered in the void, and they were endless. So when he withdrew the divine light, those energies spread out once again. He nodded slightly. That Taoist's Tao technique was indeed slightly similar to his Tao technique, and it gave him more reference. Along with the improvement of the Qi Tao technique, it also brought about more changes. Many things that he couldn't do before could be done now. For example, he could find more places that contained the essence of creation. If he transmitted the Tao technique into this place, it would undoubtedly be able to push him to find more missing Taos. Another example was the last Pauline that he thought he couldn't find before, but now he could try to find it. When he thought up to here, he didn't hesitate to immediately search for Bu Su Tian in his consciousness, and he found the muddy sky where Tai Heng, Hong Yu, and the others were trapped that day. Previously, he judged that this Pauline was very likely to be in the possession of the Lord of Muddy Sky. If he could obtain the Pauline's vital energy from him, then the last bit of his strength would be able to be made up for. A complete strength body wasn't just an increase in strength, it also represented that he had mastered a part of the Grand Tao, and the increase in strength was immeasurable. Moreover, based on the current situation, no matter if it was the land of creation or the grand Tao behind the spirit of creation, all of them had to be maintained. But similarly, all of them were extremely fragile under the great virtue Weili. They could resist ordinary Weili, but if the spirit of creation's true body insisted on destroying all of them, then he might not be able to protect them. This made it obvious that the remaining lotus was extremely important. Not only could this item help him perfect his Tao of strength, but if he really obtained this great Tao, he could completely replace the use of the Bao lotus. Even if everything was destroyed, he could rebuild it with his own power. In this way, he would have less to worry about when fighting against the true body of the spirit of creation. Just as he was thinking, he had already entered the chaotic sky with a single thought. Although it wasn't difficult for him to enter this place before this, he could sense that if he were to forcefully do this, then this place would definitely collapse and he would definitely not be able to see anything in the end. Yet now, he was able to enter this place without causing such an outcome. Now that he was here, as long as he came into contact with the Lord of Pure Heaven's Weili, he would be able to return the Lord of Pure Heaven. However, just as he was about to do so, an ethereal voice sounded. "Fellow Taoist, we have never interfered with each other, so why did you come looking for me?" Zhang Yan's sleeves fluttered as he said, "I only came here to ask one thing." The voice asked, "What is it?" Zhang Yan raised his head and said, "I want to ask for the creation Pauline in your hands." The voice was silent for a while before it said, "I don't have the creation Pauline in my hands. Or rather, I used to have it, but I later abandoned it." Zhang Yan thought for a while and said, "Is it because of your own Tao technique?" The voice said, "Yes, for the sake of Tao technique, it needs to be like this. After abandoning it, if I try to summon it again, it will only destroy my pure Tao technique." Zhang Yan said, "Then do you know where it ended up?" The voice said, "If you want to ask for the Pauline that I abandoned, I'm afraid you won't be able to find it. It has already fallen into the hands of the creation spirit." Zhang Yan's eyes flickered. He had actually thought of this outcome before. If others could think of the 12 Pauline flowers that could reopen everything, the creation spirit wouldn't have thought of it. Then, as long as this person obtained one of them, he would be able to break through the situation. The voice said, "Fellow Taoist, are you looking for this to deal with the creation spirit?" Zhang Yan nodded and said, "Indeed." The voice said, "Now that the creation spirit is trapped in the calamity power, it is a game between the fellow Taoists and it. The final outcome is still uncertain, but both sides have their own arrangements and will not allow external forces to interfere. Fellow Taoist, why don't you sit by the side and watch? If you rashly interfere, I'm afraid you will be ostracized by both sides. For the fellow Taoists, this is not deliberately targeting you, but to stabilize their own arrangements. They have no choice, do you understand?" Zhang Yan's eyes narrowed. The moment the spirit of creation was sealed away, he saw many things. Some of them were even vague. On the surface, it seemed that it was just as this person had said, telling him not to be in a hurry to get involved. He knew that when Zhu Dade bestowed the creation spirit with the creation spirit, he must have thought about how to deal with the situation if an accident happened. His current strength might be enough to control the situation. Perhaps someone was afraid that there would be additional variables here, so they used this person's words to inform him. Seeing that he didn't speak, the voice said again, "Fellow Taoist, you need to understand that no matter who it is, it will be difficult to shake the entire chess game with their own strength. Why do you need to spend more effort? It's fine as long as you can make a contribution at the crucial moment." Zhang Yan said indifferently, "According to fellow Taoist, being in this place, could it be that you can only go with the flow?" The voice said, "Isn't it good to go with the flow? With the strength of one person, even if he wants to change the world, it will be difficult to go against the will of the masses." Zhang Yan said, "What is the masses? What is oneself? Are the heavens Vedanta the masses, or the living beings of the worlds the masses?" The voice said, "The living beings of the worlds." Is fellow Taoist talking about the Tao of the spirit? Zhang Yan was indifferent and didn't say anything. The voice thought that he had tacitly agreed, so it said, "The Tao of the spirit is indeed the Tao that we lack." It is indeed a good thing that fellow Taoist can take the initiative, but even if you can monopolize this Tao, it will be difficult to shake the general trend. This general trend is the competition between the heavens Vedanta and the creation spirit. Once you fall into the game, you have to go with it. Those who go against you will be expelled. Zhang Yan smiled indifferently and didn't say anything more to him. With a wave of his sleeves, he walked out of the muddy sky. With a turn of his consciousness, he returned to the Qinghuan Palace. He pondered for a while. Although the other party's words seemed to have the same meaning as what the heavens Vedanta said, he understood that the same thing could often lead to different conclusions if it was said in different ways. He had his own understanding and judgment about what was going on behind this matter, so he wouldn't be easily swayed by the other party's words. Moreover, the other party was only a wisp of consciousness after all. It was just that if the creation spirit Pauline had really fallen into the hands of the creation spirit, even if it was still in the void, he wouldn't be able to find it. In this case, he could only solve the matter in front of him. With this thought in mind, he immediately called out in the will of the spirit. Dan Yi's consciousness wandered in the unknown land for a long time, but he still couldn't find the person the Whaley had entrusted his consciousness to. But at this moment, he suddenly felt a wisp of consciousness calling out to him. After weighing the pros and cons, he finally chose to withdraw from this place. As soon as his consciousness returned, he immediately connected with Zhang Yan's will and said apologetically, "I'm ashamed that I've let you down. I haven't been able to find the person the creation Whaley entrusted his consciousness to." Zhang Yan said, "You don't have to blame yourself. Since the creation spirit has arranged this, it won't be so easy to find him. Fortunately, I've been cultivating Tao recently and have some other insights. I already have a way to solve this matter, so you don't have to take the risk anymore." After settling this matter, he left Busu Tian and came to the domain created by Xiang Ju and the others. Xiang Ju and the others hurriedly got up to welcome him and said, "Fellow Taoist Xianyuan is here." After greeting them, Zhang Yan looked at the Taoist in purple and asked, "How's the situation?" Xiang Ju said, "It's still the same as before, maintaining a balanced situation. Now it's difficult for us to attract the Whaley from the myriad beings, but it's also difficult for them to take our power back." Zhang Yan said, "I have a way to solve this matter once and for all." He met everyone's gaze and said, "I intend to make this person take the initiative to absorb the Whaley, and then banish them into eternal silence." Everyone looked at each other. If this method was successful, it could indeed solve this matter. The Taoist in purple was at least at the level of Vedanta. If he was the one to attract the Whaley, the person the Whaley entrusted his consciousness to could not be compared to him. But the premise was that this person had to be willing to do it. Once the power of the seal was released, it would already be good if the person did not resist. How could he do as they wished? Zhang Yan said, "I understand everyone's concerns. I have a way to make him listen to you." Xiang Ju said, "Since fellow Taoist Xianyuan said so, then you must be confident. It's just that we can still use this person for now. If he is banished, the spirit of creation will no longer have a body to entrust his consciousness to. If there are any strange movements, it will be difficult for us to predict." Zhang Yan said indifferently, "Don't worry, we won't need this person in the future." In the past, when it came to such a major event that could cause additional changes, even if their magic power was not as strong as Zhang Yan's, they would still argue. But after the battle with the spirit of creation, Zhang Yan's reputation was now extremely high. Hearing him say this, everyone chose to believe him. They all bowed and left. At the same time, everyone slowly released the suppression on the Taoist in purple. As soon as the Whaley withdrew, the Taoist immediately woke up. Almost at this moment, he was about to collapse his body and wait for it to condense somewhere in the void. However, at this moment, a five-colored brilliance flashed across his body. He felt empty, and the Whaley on his body disappeared. His consciousness also went blank, and he fell into a coma. Zhang Yan stretched out a finger. As his sleeve fluttered, a ray of brilliance penetrated the Taoist's brow. The purple-clothed Taoist was stunned for a moment before he came back to his senses. He looked around at everyone, and his gaze finally fell on Zhang Yan. He bowed sincerely and said, "Thank you for freeing me." Chapter 2289. After Zhang Yan deduced the Taoist technique revealed by the spirit of creation's true body, he could see through all the details of the purple-robed Taoist at a glance. With the circulation of his Weili Qi, he could easily make use of it. This was a more brilliant method than simply suppressing it. If he were to relax a little, then the purple-robed Taoist would immediately return to his original appearance. However, the purple-robed Taoist would no longer have this chance. When this matter was done, he would naturally banish him into eternal silence, and it would be impossible for him to cause any more trouble. The purple-robed Taoist said, "I wonder what do you need me to do to help me escape?" Zhang Yan said, "Summon Pauline and let me take a look." The purple-robed Taoist immediately did as he was told. With a wave of his hand, a Pauline appeared on his palm. Zhang Yan cast a glance at it, but he shook his head. As expected, this Pauline was the one that the purple-robed Taoist had previously held, and he had already obtained the qi in it. Things were not so easy. It was obvious that the spirit of creation was also guarding against its incarnation being used by others. Therefore, it seemed that the missing one could not be found using the purple-robed Taoist's incarnation. However, this Pauline would also become an ownerless item after the purple-robed Taoist was banished into eternal silence. With his cultivation base, if it was someone else, they might give up this item for the sake of pure Tao. However, he was different. With the Tao of strength as his backing, it would not be a problem for him to keep all of the Pauline. Therefore, with a thought, he kept it. The purple-robed Taoist did not have any objection to this at all. He said respectfully, "I wonder if there is anything else that you want me to do?" Zhang Yan said, "You just need to keep the spirit of creation Weili inside into your body later." Without hesitation, the purple-robed Taoist bowed and said, "As you wish." At this moment, his mind had been manipulated by Zhang Yan. In his heart, as long as he swallowed all of these Weili, he would be able to get rid of the shackles of the spirit of creation. This was following his own heart because no independent individual would want to be like a marionette. From the bottom of his heart, he hoped to get rid of all of this, but the final result would probably be somewhat different from what he expected. He walked to the side under the complicated gaze of the Dade Masters and sat down. Then, the Weili on his body surged. A moment later, the endless Weili immediately gathered into his body. Previously, Xiang Ju and the others were only using his Weili, and it was already good to have 1 or 2% of it. Now that he was thinking for himself, the effects of both sides were naturally very different. The person who could originally fight against him with the Weili was now no match for him at all. All the Weili of the same origin had fallen to his side. Zhang Yan looked up at the land of desolation and fragmented nothingness. He wanted to see if the spirit of creation would respond to this. If it hid and did not come out, then he could only let him clean up all the Weili and easily destroy the arrangement. If it came out, it would definitely struggle or use other means. But no matter what, as long as it reacted, then he would be able to see more things. This matter could not be completed in a short period of time. Therefore, while waiting, he also divided a part of his attention to follow the Weili that gathered in this world to look for the faintly discernible lands of creation. At this moment, the might of his Tao art far surpassed Xiang Ju's group, and he'd found 3 places of fortune in succession. If he could plant a Tao inheritance in such a place and help him find his missing Tao, then he naturally wouldn't complain about having too many. However, while waiting, he could also feel that as the Weili on the purple-clothed Taoist increased, the Taoist's own will was also awakening, and he slowly gained a trace of resistance. This was already within his expectations. However, if the Taoist had the support of the spirit of creation, perhaps he could still struggle for a while. But this was desolation. If the spirit of creation Weili had no support here, then it would not be able to fight against him. He changed his mind and slightly increased his strength. The struggling expression of the purple-clothed Taoist immediately calmed down. Just like just now, he did not resist at all and continued to do his best to absorb the Weili. At that moment, Xiang Ju and the others could clearly feel that the spirit of creation Weili that filled the surroundings was becoming thinner and thinner. Even the heavy pressure in their hearts was slightly reduced. However, their expressions were still solemn, and they didn't completely relax because of this. Although the previous progress was smooth, it didn't mean that they would definitely succeed. They also didn't know if the original spirit of creation would have any countermeasures. Only by completely expelling this mighty force could this matter be considered to have temporarily come to an end. After a long time, the purple-clothed Taoist used all his strength and finally absorbed all the Weili. Even the Weili that the clone of the spirit of creation had deliberately spread during the battle with Feng Du was absorbed into his body. But at this moment, the Taoist's expression changed, as if he was faintly trying to break free from the control. Zhang Yan looked on indifferently. After repeatedly deducing the righteous path of the spirit of creation, he noticed that there was a slight change before the latter was sealed back. Therefore, he guessed that after the remnants of the mighty force were removed, this fellow most likely had some other tricks up his sleeves. Therefore, he purposely loosened some of the restraints to see if he could draw it out. But after waiting for a long time, there was still no movement. Zhang Yan glanced at the Taoist in purple and waved his sleeve. The Taoist's expression first stiffened, and then his body gradually turned from corporeal to incorporeal. After a moment, he disappeared without a trace, and even his Weili disappeared. Obviously, he had been completely sent into eternal silence. All the old troubles had been swept away. Everyone present felt refreshed, and the uncomfortable feeling they had in the past had also disappeared. Xiang Ju came forward and bowed. "Thank you for sweeping away the filth, fellow Taoist." Everyone bowed one after another. Zhang Yan said, "This matter is far from over. The true body of the spirit of creation will return sooner or later. Everyone, the battle between us and it will have to be settled. Everyone, please try your best to draw back your Weili so that you won't have the ability to resist when the time comes." Everyone sternly agreed. After Zhang Yan finished giving instructions, he returned to Bushutian. After sitting on the praying mat, he pondered for a while. Although he eliminated the Weili of the spirit of creation this time, he did not force out the spirit of creation's backup plan. The spirit of creation would either lay dormant and not make a move, or it would start from the place that he valued. Now, the breakthrough point that he could find was undoubtedly the missing great Tao behind the spirit of creation. This was also the place where the spirit of creation was most likely to obstruct him. If the spirit of creation was willing to show its ability, then he would exchange a few more blows here. After thinking for a while, he stretched out his hand and pointed. Then, he set up a realm gate in those places of creation. Then, he sent an order to the Yen sect to spread the Tao here. In the main altar of the Yen sect, Gao Qingtu quickly received the message. He didn't dare to delay and hurriedly gathered all the elders and said, "Today, I've called everyone here because the patriarch has once again built the realm gates to 3 large worlds for my sect." When the elders heard this, they were all extremely excited. In order to avoid conflicts with the various forces, the sect of Yen had gathered a lot of branches in various places, but it also made the current expansion smoother than before. It was just that the domains with living beings were limited after all, and the ones with the human Tao were even rarer. It could be said that no matter if it was the void primordial sea or Bushutian, most of the worlds were barren and extinct. Therefore, such places were becoming more and more difficult to find. The purpose of the Yen sect was to spread the Tao to all the worlds in the universe. Every place where the human Tao existed must allow all living beings to have the ability to fight against demons and other races, and also have the method to lead to the great Tao. Moreover, for the ordinary middle level of the Yen sect, the wider the Tao was spread, the more they would gain in their state of mind, and the easier it would be for them to cultivate. As for the upper level, because their cultivation had already reached the end, they could only act according to the patriarch's order. However, this did not mean that they had no pursuit. Although they could cultivate to the current realm without spiritual vigor, they still needed the purple pure spiritual vigor to maintain their eternal life. Now that the spiritual vigor was declining, the purple pure spiritual vigor would decrease with every use. Moreover, the sudden appearance of the large worlds meant that it was possible to find the purple pure spiritual vigor there. Tang Yu was the calmest and said, "Patriarch, are there any powerful forces in these 3 worlds?" When the elders heard this, the emotions that were stirred up in their hearts just now calmed down. Any place with abundant spiritual vigor would definitely be occupied by a powerful force. If it wasn't a big sect, it would be a big monster or a demon. Gao Qingtu said in a deep voice, the Patriarch's order has already pointed out that in these few large worlds, the Tao of the spirit of creation is the mainstream. Ordinary sects have long been annihilated by them, so our opponents are them. An elder said, isn't that a good thing? If we were to compete with the human Tao sects for spiritual vigor, we wouldn't be able to do so. But if it's just these foreign demons, then it's just the right time to get rid of them. Gao Qingtu said with a serious expression, don't let your guard down. Because the Tao of the spirit of creation is the mainstream in these few worlds, their power is definitely not small. If we want to occupy these places, we will need to mobilize more people from the branch altars. Gao Guo thought for a moment and said, Patriarch, I'm afraid that with the power of the Yen sect alone, we won't be able to open up the situation in a short time. Moreover, if we fight so hard, our disciples will definitely suffer heavy losses. If something happens to Bu Su Tian, I'm afraid it will be difficult to resist. Gao Qingtu said, what ideas do you have? Just tell me. Gao Guo said, it's not really an idea, but I'm thinking, is it possible to join forces with the mountain and sea realm or the Qinghua heavens? We can give up some of the places with rich spiritual vigor. Although we will lose some benefits, we can ensure the safety of more disciples. Gao Qingtu thought for a moment and nodded. That's a good idea. My Yen sect protects the human Tao and spreads its Tao. Even if our disciples are weak, we can't just lose them. An elder Daoran said, Patriarch, it's just that these two sects might not give me face. Tang Yu said, you don't have to worry about that. There are a few sects in the mountain and sea realm that like to fight, and they often use foreign enemies to hone their disciples. If such a matter comes to them, they won't refuse. Gao Qingtu said in a deep voice, then it's settled. However, I have a feeling that it won't be long before there will be great changes in the worlds. We need to occupy these three realms as soon as possible. Chapter 2290. When Zhang Yan saw that the sect of Yen had already complied with the order to expand, he no longer paid any attention to it. Unless the sect of Yen was attacked by the forces of the upper echelons, he would not intervene. Otherwise, it would be difficult to find the missing Tao if the Weili was contaminated. If the spirit of creation left behind a move to obstruct him because of this, then it would be a good time for him to eliminate it. With his current magical power, unless the spirit of creation descended, it would be impossible for him to be his opponent. But perhaps the spirit of creation was unwilling to waste a move on this matter, or perhaps it was not the right time, but it did not come out to disturb him. The sect of Yan's attack on the three realms was very smooth, especially after it obtained the help of the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm and the Qinghua heaven. In particular, the sect of Yan had the realm gate, which allowed them to transfer their combat power to and fro. The three realms on the other side could not resist at all, and it did not take long for the sect of Yen to completely occupy it. It was easy to attack these realms, but it was not easy to change the minds of those who originally believed in the spirit of creation. In the past, it was easy to draw on a blank piece of paper, but it was not the case now. Forcibly erasing their memories might hurt their souls, and it would be difficult to produce outstanding people in this way. Therefore, they could only rely on the various deacons and altar masters to cover their memories, and then preach scriptures day and night to guide them to the sect of Yan's Tao. At this moment, Zhang Yan's divine sense was wandering in the silence, trying to find more places of fortune before the real battle. The Lord of Muddy Heaven had said that he should follow the general trend and not interfere in the overall situation, or he would be abandoned by both sides. But how could he be frightened by these words? In fact, if he wanted to, he could destroy the situation at any time. He only needed to see the spirit of creation's Tao in his divine will, and he could naturally lead it into everything. When he fought with others, he never liked to wait passively. Just now was his usual choice. Therefore, he had been thinking whether there was no need to wait any longer, and whether he should directly reveal the spirit of creation to fight with him. If he had all his strength, he would definitely do so, but the current situation still needed to be considered. The main reason was that as more places of fortune were found and the expansion of the Yen sect, more and more Taoist techniques were made up for. As for the last Pauline flower, even though it was hidden by the spirit of creation and the chances of finding it were very slim, he would not give up just like that. In the end, he would still try to search for it. However, right at this moment, a wave of fluctuation suddenly arose somewhere in the 3 dimensions, and it seemed like something unusual had occurred. With a thought, he calculated for a moment and shook his head with a smile. When I need it, it never comes. When I don't ask for it, it just comes. It was one of the 3 realms. Due to the abundance of spiritual vigor, it was only slightly weaker than the Mirror Lake. Moreover, it had experienced the massacre of the followers of Yanjiao and creation spirit Taoism. As a result, karma was stirred and the primordial jade was about to enter the world. He pondered for a moment. If there were no accidents, his qi and strength would not have much improvement in a short period of time. In the battle against the spirit of creation, although the Vedanta were also trying to summon the Wali, it was really hard to say how much strength they would recover in the end, and how much help they would be. Therefore, he had to find another way to increase his strength. This primordial jade might be able to help a fellow Taoist, and make him or her help. He retracted his thoughts and allowed the world to spin for thousands of years. Then, he probed into it again. After a moment, he raised his hand and a primordial jade fell into his hand. With that, he returned to his incarnation in the green heavenly temple in the mountain and sea realm. Then, he willed it, and a watery glow appeared, which then coalesced into the black turtle, floating above the temple. He smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, you were born from the laws of heaven and earth, and your spirit shines upon the world. However, you are bound by the world and can no longer improve. Today, I will help you to break through the cage, and reveal your Tao above all." As he spoke, he handed over the primordial jade, and the snake head behind the black tortoise bit it. Under his Wali comfort, it only took a moment for the black tortoise to enter the true Yang realm. It was extremely difficult for a Taoist cultivator to enter the gate of cultivation, but the black tortoise was guided by his spirit, so it was connected to his qi. The black tortoise would be able to advance to whatever level he could advance to. Previously, it was only because of the primordial jade that it had been blocked outside the door. Now that it had obtained this item, it would naturally succeed in an instant. However, under normal circumstances, even if there was a fortuitous encounter, it would still end there. It was limited by its foundation, and there were certain gates that were difficult to pass. However, this time, Zhang Yan happened to be helping it pass this gate, or else he would not have passed the primordial jade into its body. The black tortoise was one of the 4 gods in the heavens, and with the unity of these 4 gods, the stars in the heavens had their positions. Its essence was one side of the laws of the heavens, and it could also be said that it was the precipitation of the great Tao in every world. As long as there was a boundary, it would exist. However, without anyone to unite and refine it, it would not reveal itself on its own. At that time, it was also because the divine beast egg happened to communicate with that spiritual qi that it was able to break out of its shell. And this kind of egg, Zhang Yan had only seen it in the 9 continents throughout the heavens, and there was not a trace of it anywhere else. It could be seen that it was because of the uniqueness of the 9 continents that this thing was able to be born. It was actually not difficult for him to let it cross the barrier of the current world and transcend above all, because the black tortoise was not a cultivator, and it did not rely on its own cultivation. However, even if it entered the spirit refinement realm, it would be of limited help to him unless he could reach the level of great virtue. This was not easy to achieve. In the past, he could not do it, but now that he had this creation Pauline in his hand, he could try to push it. And the first thing he had to do was to help it cross the spirit refinement realm. When the black tortoise took form in this world, the level of the true Yang had already reached its peak. It was like a jar of water that was already full. Even if additional energy was poured into it, it would only overflow and not increase. However, if this jar was broken, it would be able to flow into the vast ocean. What he had to pay attention to was that this place still required him to use his qi and constantly guide it. He could not let it do things on its own. Otherwise, in the end, it would either be lost and unable to form again, or it would be formed according to the Tao and completely separated from him, which would be far from his original intention. After making up his mind, with a thought, a ray of light shone down from beyond the world and landed on the black tortoise, instantly breaking the restraints on it. In that instant, the world seemed to rise endlessly, and the black tortoise instantly stepped into a level that all beings in the world could not reach. However, because it did not rely on its own power to achieve this, its foundation did not change fundamentally. It was only because of Zhang Yan's Weili protection that it did not collapse. At this moment, Zhang Yan stretched out a finger, and a speck of light suddenly appeared. At this moment, all the uncertain world seemed to stop. Then, the silhouettes of the black tortoise appeared in the billions of worlds, and all the silhouettes overlapped and stacked together. The billions of worlds also had a fixed black tortoise, but they belonged to different realms and did not interfere with each other. Therefore, what he was doing now was to draw out the power of the black tortoise in the worlds and use the black tortoise as the foundation to gather its power. Just like how countless droplets of water could gather into a river, it gradually grew stronger after the power of origin gathered. However, the power of each world was different, so it needed to be harmonized here. The black tortoise could not do it by itself, but it was not difficult with him presiding over it. Not long after, the commotion finally stopped. The black tortoise's figure had become solid, which meant that it could stand in the silence. Zhang Yan nodded slightly. The Dharma body of a cultivator with a human body was a copy of the original body, and the demons turned into a human because the cultivation of the human body was the closest to the great Tao, so they had no choice but to do so. The black tortoise was the manifestation of the great Tao, so it did not need to turn into a human, so there was no such thing as transformation, so it still looked the same. However, it was not the end yet. The black tortoise was at most similar to the spirit refinement Taoist cultivator and could not help him much. Therefore, he still had to help him continue to walk upwards and push him into the level of virtuous virtue. He did not act immediately. After the black tortoise's aura stabilized, he waved his sleeve and threw out the Pauline he had obtained from the purple-clothed Taoist. He imprinted it into the black tortoise's body and said, "Fellow Taoist, you can search for the great Tao. I will naturally help you by the side. If you can return, you can pluck the great Tao fruit." At the same time, he sent the secret method of ascension into the black tortoise's mind. The black tortoise's eyes were originally half closed, but after receiving the teaching, it let out a low roar. The water vapor under it moved, and its entire body instantly turned from being to non-being, disappearing without a trace. The black tortoise came from the Khanate world and was formed by the great Tao. It had not gone through any cultivation, so if there was no surprise, it should have taken the part of the great Tao that nurtured its body. The difficult part was to return to being. Fortunately, he now had the help of Creation Pauline. As long as he did not enter too deep into the river of the great Tao, this difficulty could be avoided. Zhang Yan only waited for a moment before the being began to sway. This change immediately attracted the attention of Xiangjue and the others. They asked with their divine will, and after learning that it was Zhang Yan who did it, they immediately retracted their minds. Immediately, the Pauline appeared again, and then it emitted rays of treasure light, sucking in the waves of Weili that fell from the sky. Then, the figure of the black tortoise appeared from nothingness and returned to being. Obviously, it had achieved the result. Zhang Yan looked over and saw that there were yin and yang, black and white energies swaying around its body. It could be said that, the tortoise and the snake are one body, yin and yang bind life and death. He subconsciously nodded. If the yin and yang energies worked together with his divine light of the 5 elements, his combat ability would undoubtedly increase to another level. At this moment, the black tortoise lowered its head and revealed its thick shell, making a submissive gesture. He smiled slightly and took a step forward, already stepping onto the back of the black tortoise. He praised, "From the beginning, the true Tao is only free. Xiantian is known as the divine capital. One spirit cultivates the merit of 10,000 generations, and looks down on all methods to show victory. Since fellow Taoist has already obtained the Tao technique and transcended the mortal world, there is no need for you to use that old title. You were originally a god of the Khanate world, but now that you have leaped above the gods, how about I call fellow Taoist Lord Du? Chapter 2291. The Black Tortoise, or Divine Lord Du in other words, had leaped out of the present world, so he was no longer one of the four deities of heaven and earth. He had already transcended this identity. However, because he was originally a representation of the Tao, as long as he was under the Great Tao, he would not change because he was lacking something. Therefore, even if he had leaped out, there would still be the Black Tortoise that represented the Great Tao's order in the present world to fix his position. However, Divine Lord Du himself was completely different from before. It could be said that he had gained something and then abandoned it. With a thought from Zhang Yan, the yin and yang qi surged behind Divine Lord Du, completely controlled by his will. The latter was originally brought into the world by him, and now that it had transcended the present world, the two could be said to have the same qi. Divine Lord Du's Tao was also compatible with his. With the two working together, it seemed like his battle prowess would be greater than before. However, he had not verified it, so he had to use his divine will to deduce it. If there was anything wrong, it could be improved. Therefore, he turned his divine will and entered the unknown. There was no need to lure out the spirit of creation's true body again. He could resist that strand of power by himself, so it was not enough to test anything. Therefore, he had to find another opponent. With a thought, several figures appeared in front of him. They were similar to Fengdu, Xiangjue, and the others, but also slightly different. Their expressions were indifferent, and they did not look human at all. This was the appearance of the spirit of creation's Tao after he deduced it with this generation's Tao. However, this generation's true body might not necessarily look like this. To a Vedanta, a complete Wali and an incomplete Wali were two different things. Even if it was just a thin line, it was still a difference of heaven and earth. Therefore, with this generation's current state, even if the spirit of creation's true body came again, it would be impossible to take it down with a simple Wali collision. Of course, the spirit of creation did not unleash its full power, but he only wanted to verify the results. It was enough to test everyone's Tao when they were almost complete. With a thought, he ordered the Black Tortoise to take the initiative, and the people on the other side immediately responded. Every single person of this generation would utilize their own Tao arts to guide their attacks, and their objective was only to annihilate their opponents. They wouldn't have the slightest hesitation towards themselves, and coupled with their joint forces, their ability in battle would only be stronger than a real person. After several attempts, Zhang Yan had a rough idea of what to do. Seeing that there was nothing else he needed to do, he retreated from the divine will. As he divined, he seemed to have touched upon something. He stood up and took a few steps in the hall. Suddenly, his eyes lit up and he looked up at the billions of worlds. In the past, he'd once sensed that the evolution of Tao arts was a battle between each other. It was just like the collision of the great virtue Wali, the battle between the great virtues and the spirits of creation, and the battle between the teachings of the Yen sect and the various Tao inheritances. It was precisely because of this battle that he was able to draw closer to the Grand Tao. Presently, his Tao art had improved greatly when compared to before, yet he'd seen even more things because of this, and his comprehension towards the profundities of the Grand Tao had undoubtedly deepened a level. To be more precise, the reason why the battle between Tao arts was able to allow them to have a glimpse of the Grand Tao was actually because it had pushed the luck of the Grand Tao. Such actions were slightly in line with the essence of the Grand Tao, but they were still slightly off from the true Grand Tao. The luck of the Grand Tao had no beginning or end, and it had no cause or effect. Regardless of whether one's Tao art was brilliant or not, so long as one hadn't attained the state where there was only one Tao, then one would fall within it. The difference was that those who resided at the top like the great virtues were able to stir up turbulent waves within the long river of the Grand Tao, whereas those at the bottom were similarly within it, so there was naturally no difference between them. The great virtues had a Tao, and so did the spirits of creation. The latter was an incomplete law, and no matter if it was the spirits of creation or the great virtues, all of them desired this Tao. Whoever grasped it would compete for the upper hand, and this was the chance to determine victory. So in this aspect, the Tao of the great virtues was comparatively lighter, and the Tao of the spirits of creation was comparatively heavier. The battle between the great virtues directly omitted the changes at the bottom, and this actually wasn't favored by the Grand Tao. The Grand Tao itself didn't have any preferences, but the outcome would naturally be different if one went against the Tao or went along with it. In the past, they only sought the top, and neglected the variables at the bottom. The reason for this was that for the great virtues, the bottom could be manipulated at will. Even if there was, they could overturn it with their strength, so what was the need to pay attention to it? However, since the bottom was also within the Grand Tao, and the great virtues sought the complete Grand Tao, how could they throw it aside? Therefore, he believed that it wasn't feasible to lean towards either side, and that both sides needed to be equally valued. Just as he was pondering, Xiang Ju and the others were very surprised by the sudden appearance of a great virtue in the void. On the surface, the position of the great virtue completely depended on the fortune of Pauline. If someone achieved enough merit and obtained this item, then they could take over the position. However, in reality, it wasn't that easy. Not everyone who held on to Pauline could achieve anything. Before Xiang Ju and the others, there were people who borrowed this item and climbed up to the top, but other than the great virtues that existed now, the others were lost in the long river of the Grand Tao, never to come out again. Wei Ming pondered for a while and said, "This fellow cultivator must be the one who achieved spirit refinement when I sensed something strange just now. From the looks of it, this person should have been supported by fellow cultivator Xianyuan. However, it is unexpected that he could achieve great virtue." Ji Zhuang identified it and said, "This Tao friend's Tao is unique. He isn't of a different race, nor is he a human cultivator. It seems like he took one end of the Grand Tao and manifested it on the surface." Heng Wu said, "Then it must be Tao friend Xuanyuan's method, but how did he do it?" Everyone was silent. Helping someone achieve spirit enhancement was something they could do if they were willing to do their best, but helping someone achieve great virtue was not something they could do. Thus, everyone faintly guessed in their hearts that perhaps Zhang Yan had obtained this ability after he obtained their Tao arts. But this was something that couldn't be obtained by being envious. Even if they were to view the Tao arts of others, it would only be able to guarantee that they would be able to suppress their opponents in battle, but they wouldn't be able to utilize it. Just as they were talking, they suddenly felt a throbbing in their hearts, and unconsciously looked towards where the robbery power was. It wasn't difficult for them to notice that the robbery power that was obstructing the spirit of creation was getting thinner and thinner. It was obvious that the shackles that were binding him were getting lighter. Even though there was still the force of great virtue there, it was hard to say when the situation would collapse. The previous battle had allowed them to understand just how weak they were when facing that person. If they wanted to survive the next battle, then they would only have a chance if they fully recovered their strength. However, judging from their current progress, there was practically no hope for them to do so. Xiang Ju then said, "Everyone, is there any progress in recruiting the Weili?" Heng Wu said, "Even though the tribulation energy has been greatly weakened, we're still able to endlessly summon our own tribulation energy back to us. However, the tribulation energy we obtain is truly too weak, and the spirit of creation is about to arrive again." He couldn't help but shake his head when he spoke up to hear. Wei Ming frowned and said, "I also feel that this is not the way to go." Heng Wu felt this way, and so did he. He could also feel the threat of the spirit of creation approaching. Last time, they had been forced into nothingness without being able to put up any resistance. If the spirit of creation had not deliberately targeted them, they would have fallen into eternal silence. He did not want to experience that again. He looked at Xiang Ju and said, "Tao friend, what do you think?" Xiang Ju said, "Since Tao friend Xianyuan can help others become my peers, if I ask him for advice on how to recruit the Weili, I believe he can give us some advice. At the very least, we can benefit from it, right?" Everyone thought about it and felt that it made sense. Before, it was because everyone's Tao was different, so it was better to ask oneself than to ask others. But now, each of their Tao had been dispelled by Zhang Yan. In a sense, he might know their weaknesses and strengths better than they did themselves. In addition, they thought that Zhang Yan would be willing to teach them if he had the ability to fight against the spirit of creation. Xiang Ju saw that Hongdu was silent, so he tried to ask, "What does Dao friend Fengdu think?" Hongdu said without hesitation, "It is a good idea to ask Dao friend Xianyuan. We don't have to wait, let's go and ask him now." The purple-robed Taoist was no longer in the world they created, and the spirit of creation Weili on the surface was also swept away. The effect of this world was greatly reduced. Therefore, there was no need for them to stay. They immediately came out and went to the front of Butian. They bowed and said, "Is Dao friend Xianyuan here? We have a question that we would like to consult with you." Zhang Yan walked out from Bu Su Tian and bowed, saying, "Fellow Taoists, what business do you have here?" Xiang Ju said, "Dao friend, you asked us to go back and summon the Weili to recover our strength to fight against the spirit of creation. However, it is difficult for us to continue here. Dao friend's Dao is much better than ours, so we came here to ask for your advice." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. Whether it was passive or active, the more people who could fight against the spirit of creation, the better. He said, "Just give me a strand of your qi dynamic. I will go back and deduce it. If there are any results, I will inform you in time." Xiang Ju said, "Then I will leave it to you." No one had any objections. Even their Dao was handed over, so a strand of qi dynamic was not a problem. Therefore, they each gave a strand of qi to Zhang Yan and left. Zhang Yan retracted his consciousness back into Butian. He was still unable to complete the Weili. In fact, he had considered this problem not long ago. The Taoist that existed in his consciousness would collapse every time he tried to reform it. Therefore, it was very likely that the Taoist had given up on it. Therefore, he believed that if it was not the spirit of creation that caused the Weili to be completely restored, it was very likely that the Taoist had given up on it. As for what the reason was, he could not guess. Perhaps it was because he wanted to save a part of his strength to help suppress the spirit of creation, or perhaps he simply did not want to fall into the hands of the Taoist. However, since it was able to attract a bit of mighty power, it meant that there was still room for improvement. Even if it couldn't be completed, it wouldn't be a problem if he tried to speed up the process. Moreover, he also wanted to see if there would be any abnormal changes if he gave it a push. Chapter 2292. Zhang Yan was very interested in the changes within the robbery power. He did not know what the situation was like there. When the spirit of creation broke through the next time, would the Vedantas be unable to stop him and have no choice but to let him escape, or would they deliberately let him fall into the hands of others? The results of the two were the same, but there was obviously more to the latter. From the words of the Lord of the Prison Realm, it seemed that every step was within the calculations of the Vedantas. On the other hand, perhaps every step was within the calculations of the spirit of creation. Until the end, no one would know whose methods were better. However, he was not willing to passively fall into the trap. With his current ability, he could let the spirit of creation fall into the hands of others at any time. From this point, he was also qualified to be a chess player. However, he knew too little, so he did not rashly try. Now that the Vedantas were searching for the complete path of the Weili, he could first make a small probe. With the Tao techniques of perception and the others, he had previously deduced them to perfection. Now that he had everyone's qi dynamic, if there were no obstacles, he could easily find everyone. And he wanted to take the opportunity to touch that obstacle and see what was stopping this generation of Weili from being complete. He immediately entered the divine will. With a thought, he deduced upwards based on everyone's qi dynamic. If one were to say that the few people who fought against Divine Monarch Du just now were purely reflections of his complete Tao technique, then if one could successfully deduce this, one would be able to reproduce the appearance of his true mighty power when it was in its complete form. If they were unwilling, then they would be like the Taoist with a broken will, unable to do it. As he deduced, everyone's qi dynamic turned into an image of themselves. Then, it turned from illusion to reality and slowly became clearer. Things went smoothly up to this point. However, just as they were about to be completely complete, everyone's figure distorted and then collapsed. His eyes flashed slightly, but he did not immediately come to a conclusion. Instead, he tried a few more times, but the results were the same. There were no exceptions. Once or twice might be an accident, but the results were the same. This was enough to confirm his previous deduction. However, it was a pity that there were no changes in the robbery power this time. However, since he had promised everyone that he would help them solve the problem of summoning the mighty power that was too slow, he would naturally not go back on his word. In his eyes, this was a simple matter. The reason why everyone found it so difficult was because the mighty power itself was resisting them. However, if everyone understood this and the method of summoning the mighty power was even more appropriate, as long as they did not touch the final line, there would be no problem. He only needed to deduce a little and he had an appropriate method. Thus, he retreated from the divine will and stepped out of Busu Tian. In the blink of an eye, he arrived in that world. After greeting Xiang Ju and the others, he said, "I have all the techniques you need here. You can all take a look." With that, he waved his sleeve and 7 rays of light flew toward one person each. After Wei Ming saw this technique, he first nodded, and then he frowned and said, "I see that this technique can indeed help me summon more of my own power, but it doesn't seem to be able to fully recover. Is there something wrong with this method?" Zhang Yan smiled and said, "If there's anything wrong with it, it's because I've deduced that the root of this problem lies with your own bodies. It's because you're unwilling to return in one piece, so it's difficult to complete the cultivation." "Is that so?" Everyone was shocked when they heard this, but they were also pondering about the reason behind it. Zhang Yan looked at everyone and said, "In truth, there is no need to force yourself if you cannot do this. Right now, the Weili can recover as much as it can. I believe there must be a reason for your original bodies to do this, and you won't sit by and watch your bodies be destroyed. It is very likely that after your original bodies arrive, the Weili will be complete just now." Everyone's hearts moved. They seemed to have thought of something, but they also felt like they were missing something and couldn't figure it out. However, at least the problem before them was solved. There were many things that could be slowly explored during their cultivation. Everyone talked to each other again, then they all bowed to Zhang Yan and said, "Thank you, fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan nodded slightly, then his figure faded and disappeared. After returning to Bushu Heaven, he once again sent his consciousness into the silence to search for the land of fortune hidden in the unknown world. The number of land of fortune he could find was actually closely related to the cultivation of the great virtues Tao. Now that his Tao was much better than before, he could do this again. After searching in every possible way, it didn't take long for him to find another land of fortune. However, it couldn't compare to the 3 land of fortune he found last time. This meant that it would be very difficult to find a similar place in the future. But this time, it wasn't purely for the sake of finding such a place, and it was for the sake of confirming a thought in his heart as well. So, he didn't order the sect Yen to invade this world right away, and he split out an avatar of his own to descend into the main world that attached itself to this place of creation. Ever since he became a refined god, apart from the mountain and sea realm, his incarnation rarely manifested in the main world. This was because the main world was like a picture to him. If he wanted to, he could even circulate it for millions of years in the blink of an eye. Therefore, it was meaningless to communicate with each other. This was also the reason why the being in the imprisoned world didn't care about the living beings. After all, whether they lived or died had nothing to do with him. However, he didn't think so. Apart from a few people who had achieved Xiantian success, most of the almighty beings had obtained their achievements from the cultivation of lowly living beings. The difference was that in the beginning, the essence of fortune hadn't been broken, and living beings had Xiantian Taoist magic to follow. Later people had nothing to rely on, and could only rely on the teachings of their predecessors. Now, all the great virtues he saw were achieved before the essence of fortune was broken. He was the only one who achieved the Tao after that. However, it was also because of this that he valued the living beings of the world and the inheritance of Taoist magic more than any of his peers. In the blink of an eye, Zhang Yan's incarnation was already standing on a piece of land. He looked around. Even though he had erased the Wei of the spirit of fortune, it was still there. The Taoist magic of the spirit of fortune was still the mainstream here. This Taoist magic could actually be considered a human Taoist magic. Only living beings could cultivate it, and it was also very useful when fighting against demons and beasts. If they just followed their own Tao, it wouldn't be a big deal, and he could also tolerate it. However, the problem was that this place proclaimed that if a cultivator wanted to walk up, they must follow the Taoist magic. If a cultivator worshipped this wholeheartedly and cultivated the fruit of Tao in this way, he couldn't be called a human anymore. He would only become a puppet of the spirit of fortune. At this moment, he took a step forward and came to a neat and clean wide jade path. Here, countless pious people were pushing each other's shoulders, supporting each other as they walked forward. With a glance, he understood that this was a path to enlighten the mind. Only those who truly followed the Tao could reach the end in an instant. If they didn't follow the Tao, they could only walk on endlessly. The eyes of the people in the group were numb, and they staggered as they followed the crowd forward. Most of them didn't even know where they should go. At this moment, a young man with a dispirited expression, whose eyes hadn't completely lost their spirituality, suddenly saw Zhang Yan walking on the path. He couldn't help but shiver, and he hurriedly squeezed through the crowd to the side of the path. He came up and kowtowed a few times, saying, "Taoist, I've been walking here for half a year, I wonder when I can finish this path. They all say that I'm not sincere, but how can I be considered sincere?" Zhang Yan said indifferently, "Some of the people here have walked for hundreds of years, and some have walked for dozens of years. Until now, they still haven't left this path. Do you think they are sincere?" The young man's face instantly turned pale, and he muttered a few words. Then, he came to a realization and kowtowed a few more times, begging, Taoist must have a way to teach me, please guide me." Zhang Yan looked down at him and asked, "Why do you seek the Tao?" The young man wiped his cheeks, and choked with sobs, "My hometown encountered a flood, and my entire family was trapped. I heard that if I seek the immortal and cultivate the Tao, I can save my children and parents. That's why I came here." Zhang Yan looked around. It could be said that most of the people here were like this young man. They didn't seek the Tao for the sake of seeking the Tao, but to avoid the harsh governance and hardships of the world, and to find the pure land in their hearts. This kind of situation was already very rare in the realm under the rule of the Yinjiao. What flood, what volcano, what hurricane, all these natural wei were all mediated and suppressed by the Taoists of the Yinjiao. When the heavenly stars fell, it could be broken with a finger, and the power of the earthquake could be stopped with a raise of one's hand. Apart from that, there were also the spiritual plants passed down by the Taihao lineage, which made food even more abundant, and the land was covered with mulberry and hemp. It could be said that as long as the realm under the rule of the Yinjiao was orderly, there would be no hunger. Food, clothing, and warmth were no longer the first things that mortals needed to consider. However, it was different here. The Taoists wouldn't ask you how mortals were, and they simply viewed them as Tao seeds. Anyone who walked on this path of Tao would have their bodies fixed at a certain moment, and they would be able to continue existing without any external objects. One day, their humanity would be worn away in the long path of Tao, and they would completely forget their original selves. In the end, only the obsession of turning towards the grand Tao would remain, and they could become firewood for the spirit of creation Tao technique. In reality, if the people here felt that something was wrong, they could turn back and walk out of this place. However, those who came here were all for the sake of escaping the various hardships of the world, and they even held on to the last shred of hope. Thus, they would rather live like walking corpses than leave this place. Zhang Yan shook his head. If he wanted to change this situation, he could only solve the crux of the problem from the root, and not enlighten one or two people. Thus, he didn't say anything to the young man, and with another shift of his feet, he arrived before an incomparably magnificent palace that occupied a vast area. He slowly walked inside, and soon arrived at an inner hall. There was a young cultivator sitting on a platform here, and he was frowning as he held a scroll. He seemed to have a knot in his heart that he couldn't untie. At this moment, the young cultivator also noticed something. He raised his head in surprise, and saw that Zhang Yan was standing there, but there was no greeting from outside. His expression couldn't help but turn cold, and he slowly put down the scroll. He stood up, raised his hand, and bowed, saying, "Who are you, Taoist? Why have you come here?" Chapter 2293. Zhang Yan looked at this young cultivator. His name was Qin Zhaoting, and he was a spirit of creation that was born into the world. After growing up in the mortal world for over 10 years, he was found by the cultivators here who worshipped the Tao of the spirit of creation and sent to this altar to cultivate. Under half coercion and half persuasion, Qin Zhaoting had no choice but to walk this path. He was a spirit of creation after all, and he easily cultivated to the level of mortal transformation in just a few hundred years. However, at this level, as he gradually leaned towards the Tao, the part that belonged to himself would become less and less as he continued to cultivate. Although everyone in the altar said that this was the only way to find the Tao and obtain eternity, he always felt that something was wrong and was unwilling to completely give himself over there. When the cultivators here saw that he was conflicted in his heart, coupled with the fact that he had only entered the Tao for a short period of time, they didn't press him too hard. They just kept mentioning the wonders of the Tao in front of him, hoping that he would wake up on his own one day. Zhang Yan knew what this person was thinking. Now, he was unwilling to submit to the Tao, but he didn't dare to completely go against the words of those elders, so he could only delay like this. He had once thought that although the sect Yen had spread the Tao technique and caused numerous spirits of creation to acknowledge his Tao technique, but similarly, because of the restriction of this, there was no one that acknowledged him outside of the sect Yen. Therefore, he had lost his narrow-mindedness. And if all the spirits of the world, even if they weren't the followers of Yen's sect, would still acknowledge his Tao, then it would be even easier to find the missing Tao than before. The Tao of the spirit of creation went against human nature. Up until now, none of the spirits of creation that were born into the world were truly willing to abandon themselves. Even if they did so on the surface, they merely wanted to borrow it for a while, but in their hearts, they were constantly thinking of getting rid of it after they had achieved their Tao. Therefore, from this aspect, every single one of the spirits of creation that were born into the world were coincidentally resisting their own Tao at the same time. It was just that the method they used was different. In the past, if it wasn't for the teachings of Yen's sect since young, when he encountered such a person, he would either eliminate them or erase their memories. But now, there was no harm in changing the method. And the reason why he did this himself was not to entrust it to his disciple, but to verify it. He asked, "Why do you cultivate?" Qin Zhaoting did not know the background of this person in front of him, but he instinctively felt that it was better for him to answer honestly in front of this person. He said with some embarrassment, "I cultivated Tao in the beginning so that I could eat my fill, wear my clothes, and have a safe house. Later, when I came to the headquarters and cultivated Tao, I wanted to transcend the mortal world and live forever." Zhang Yan said, "From what I can see, if you want to live forever, then you must follow the Tao and destroy yourself. At that time, you won't even be able to decide for yourself, so how can you talk about transcending? Even if you are immortal, you will still be enslaved by the Tao." Qin Zhaoting was startled for a moment. Then, he cupped his hands and asked tentatively, "Since Taoist priest has said so, can you teach me?" Zhang Yan said, "The choice is your own business, but what do you think?" Qin Zhaoting thought carefully and sighed helplessly. He said, "The elders in the headquarters told me that the Tao of creation is the supreme Tao. If I become one with it, then it won't be difficult to peek into the realm of Tao. But as Taoist priest has said, I am also unwilling to abandon myself, but as for the elders in the headquarters, I am powerless to resist, so what can I do?" Zhang Yan said, "Have you ever thought that if the Tao can swallow you, then why can't you swallow the Tao in turn?" Qin Zhaoting's heart could not help but tremble. He was surprised and hesitant. Can I do this?" Zhang Yan said, "Let me ask you, are you willing to join my Tao?" Qin Zhaoting hesitated. "Taoist priest, can I change to another Tao?" Although he did not dare to continue cultivating, he was also unwilling to abandon his original Tao. Zhang Yan smiled and shook his head. "Cultivating Tao is only cultivating the body, cultivating the heart is cultivating Tao. There are many people like you in my Tao, but they have always been independent. Therefore, Tao is not about what Tao you cultivate, but what Tao you agree with in your heart. Chen Zhaoting was puzzled at first, but then he exclaimed in surprise. He suddenly remembered that the elders in the headquarters could be said to be completely devoid of humanity. If the people outside were walking corpses, then weren't these elders puppets too? Not only them, but even some ordinary disciples were the same. On the contrary, although he also cultivated the same Tao, wasn't it because his heart was unwilling to agree with the Tao that he could always maintain his original nature? Otherwise, he would be a different person now. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it made sense. They obviously cultivated the same Tao, but the different understanding caused the different results. Most importantly, this statement was very much in line with what he wanted. Not only could it maintain his current state, but it seemed like it could also help him get out of the current predicament. He unconsciously said sincerely, "Taoist priest, what you said is very reasonable. It's just that with my own ability, I'm afraid it's difficult for me to stabilize myself. I wonder if Taoist priest can point me in the right direction." Zhang Yan pointed with his finger, and a jade scroll appeared in front of him. "After you read this, you will know what to do." Chen Zhaoting happily took it, and then asked carefully, "Taoist priest, why are you helping me?" Zhang Yan said indifferently, "I'm not helping you, I'm helping all living beings, and helping all living beings is also helping me." Chen Zhaoting did not really understand the meaning of this, but he could feel that the person in front of him could easily control him. So if he wanted to do something to him, there was no need to be so complicated. And if the Tao that the person gave him could really save him from the fate of being devoured by the Tao, then that would be the best. Even if it did not work, the result would not be too bad. He immediately cast his mind into the jade scroll, and after a while, he was absorbed in it. There was a Tao technique of teaching Yen, but because it did not ask him to change the Tao technique, he hurriedly skimmed through it. Instead, there were many scenes under the rule of teaching Yen, which made him very surprised. He had only entered Tao for 100 years, but he had cultivated to an extremely high realm, and had a lifespan of 10,000 years. Moreover, after coming to the headquarters, he had always been cultivating, and had never gone out. So his temperament was actually still the same as when he was young, and he did not like dry and boring cultivation at all. He yearned for all kinds of beautiful and interesting things, and all of these seemed to be found under the rule of teaching Yen. All of these, however, formed a clear contrast with everything in the world that he was currently in. He originally thought that the world had always been like this, because it had been like this since he was born, but now it was different. A thought of changing all of these spontaneously arose in his heart, and at the same time, he unconsciously approved of the teaching Yan's actions. With this thought, he instantly felt that he was a little further away from the Tao technique of the spirit of creation, but his mana had also weakened a little because of this. He could not help but be shocked. Although he sympathized with the people of the world, he also knew that his own cultivation was what he could rely on. If he lacked this, then he would be nothing. But right at that moment, a piece of corroded text appeared on the jade slip. With a single glance, it contained the solution to the problem. He thought about it, because just now, the mana that he had lost was not much, so he tried to cultivate according to this, but he was pleasantly surprised to find that not long after, the mana that he had lost recovered, and it was completely under his control. It was not like in the past, where it seemed like someone had entrusted it to him. He couldn't help but open his eyes. He looked over and said sincerely, "Taoist priest, your Tao technique is indeed useful. However, I'm afraid that if this goes on, the elders in the headquarters will see through my tricks. I wonder if Taoist priest can help me wipe out all the elders in the headquarters." In the headquarters, his cultivation was not the highest, and there were many elders who had already severed their past and future bodies, so he was very afraid that what he had done would be exposed. Zhang Yan said, "This matter can only be done by yourself, I will not interfere." He had already expected Chen Zhaoting's request. Every cultivator with an independent consciousness would naturally resist the Tao technique of the spirit of creation, not to mention that he had another Tao technique in his heart. In order to maintain himself, he was naturally opposed to those who worshipped Tao techniques, so even without him urging, he would take the initiative to be hostile to this generation. However, when pursuing the Tao technique behind the spirit of creation, he could not directly use his own Weili, and he could not even interfere with the specific matters. Otherwise, why would he go through so much trouble? Wouldn't it be easier to directly change the consciousness of the people of the world? Chen Zhaoting murmured, "Looks like I have to do this myself." He still bowed, and said, "I hope that Taoist priest can give me pointers from time to time." Zhang Yan nodded and said, "I will not leave this place for a while. If you have any questions, you can come and ask me at any time." Hearing his words, Chen Zhaoting's confidence instantly increased. He pondered for a while, combined the contents of the jade scroll, and thought of a way. After making some arrangements, he announced to the public that he was going to go into closed-door training. This time, he did not deal with things as he did in the past, but completely for himself, so he put all his attention into it. Since he had gotten rid of the obstacles in his heart, the potential of the body that belonged to the spirit of creation that was reincarnated into the world was fully revealed, and his cultivation base rose steadily in a very short period of time. Very soon, he had reached the level where he could sever his past and future bodies. When the elders in the headquarters heard about this, they were very happy, thinking that he had come to his senses, but at this moment, they were faced with another problem. They realized that even if Chen Zhaoting had cultivated to this level, without Zhou Huanyu and Jade, it was impossible for him to go further. These elders had cultivated for a long time, so they were faintly able to discern some inheritances from Tao arts, and they knew that he still needed something to assist Chen Zhaoting in attaining the Grand Tao. However, Origin Jade had never appeared in the outside world that was attached to the land of creation, so they had no way of knowing what it was. While they were distressed, Chen Zhaoting mentioned that he'd obtained inspiration from the Tao arts, and he had a premonition that there was a thing that could assist him. However, drawing this thing into the world depended on karma and slaughter. For example, cultivators like them had to slaughter demons and devils in order for it to be possible. All the elders were doubtful at the beginning, but after they jointly deduced it, even though they only had a vague feeling, they noticed that this was correct. In the past, they didn't care about the variant race, and so long as they didn't obstruct them, they couldn't be bothered to spare a glance at them. Now, after they found out about this matter, they immediately launched an extermination against these people. Chen Zhaoting's actions weren't entirely for the sake of Origin Jade, and it was also for the sake of relying on this to weaken the forces in the headquarters. After both sides suffered heavy losses, he would make a move and eliminate all these people. After that, he would imitate the method of teaching and completely transform the entire universe. On the other hand, Zhang Yan's clone watched silently from the side. If his thoughts could be verified, then perhaps the process of finding the missing Tao would be able to be sped up once more. Chapter 2294. In order to ensure that karma stirred, and with Chen Zhaoting's deliberate instigation behind the scenes, the elders in the main altar attacked all the alien races in the heavens and realms at the same time. This caused the strength of this generation to be greatly dispersed, and it was inevitable that they suffered many losses. Countless disciples died, and several elders even lost their lives. However, no one showed any signs of pity because of this. Instead, all of them treated it with indifference. They had long regarded themselves as a part of the Tao, so much so that they no longer considered themselves to be human. As long as they were moving towards the goal of returning to the Tao, they felt that any price was worth it. Chen Zhaoting had been waiting restlessly. The more the forces that worshipped the Tao suffered, the more advantageous it would be for him to act in the future. However, he was also afraid that the elders would find out that something was wrong and grow suspicious of him. Fortunately, this did not happen. During this period, he would visit Zhang Yan from time to time, not to ask for advice, but because he was afraid that the latter would leave. He had cultivated for a long time, and he had relied on his own potential to cultivate to such a high level. He had almost no experience in his life, so he was still lacking in temperament. With Zhang Yan around, he was still confident and could do things step by step. However, if the latter was not around, he would very likely panic and become at a loss. As the speed of replenishment was far lower than the rate of consumption, the elders also briefly adjusted their strategy of attacking everywhere at the beginning. They concentrated their forces on the few territories where the demon forces were strong. This way, the casualties were greatly reduced. Seeing this, Chen Xiaoting felt that things were not going well. If this continued, he was afraid that the demons and alien races would all be eliminated, and the elders would not suffer any more losses. He used the reason that he had not seen the Yuan Jade for a long time, and that he had not stirred enough karma, to urge them to speed up the elimination of the alien races. Because he was doing this in the name of the Tao, the elders did not have any objections, and even felt that it was very reasonable. Thus, they increased the speed of the conquest, and the casualties increased again because of this. At one point, Chen Xiaoting was worried that the elders would force him to go out and fight against the demons and alien races. Fortunately, he was still the middle hall master in name, and could be considered the incarnation of the Tao. Therefore, before an opponent that could threaten the main altar appeared, there was no need for him to appear. He only needed to stand guard at the back. After a dozen years, the number of people with profound cultivation in the main altar became fewer and fewer, and Chen Xiaoting knew that it was about time for him to act. Before this, he paid another visit to Zhang Yan to strengthen his confidence. Then, he used the middle hall master's name to summon an elder back and take care of him as quickly as possible. Seeing that things had gone smoothly, he tried to summon another person. The whole thing could be said to be a daunting experience, but not a dangerous one. These elders did not think that he would do such a thing, and it was very easy for him to succeed. Once these people were removed, the rest of the people who were not as strong as him were not a concern. After roughly a few years, he eliminated all the enemies that could pose a threat to him and took complete control of the headquarters. Thus, he came before Zhang Yan's clone and said respectfully, "Taoist priest, I've already eliminated all those people who advised me to worship the Tao. May I know what I should do now?" Zhang Yan said calmly, "I've already made my intentions clear. For yourself, you are also a person. The Tao lies in your heart, not in external laws. If you think it's feasible, then go ahead." Chen Xiaoting said seriously, "Elder, I understand." After he retreated, he changed all the worlds under his rule that had living beings of the human path according to his own will. Without the interference of those elders, it was even easier to deal with the disciples below him. He directly erased the original memories and changed them to what he wanted them to see. Almost overnight, all the disciples who originally believed in the spirit of creation Tao listened to him. However, he wouldn't really trust these people. He was prepared to wait for the next generation of Taoist cultivators to grow up, and then he would replace all of them. He acted according to the rules of the Yen sect that he saw in the Jade Scroll. Mortals had suffered too much in the current situation of the worlds. No matter what he did, it was better than before. Even if there was something wrong, he would try to change it. It would not be worse than before. In just a few decades, the worlds that were attached to this land of creation were almost the same as the Yen sect's rule except for the difference in the cultivation of Tao. Zhang Yan quickly sensed that the obstruction in his deduction of the Tao art that was lacking had decreased slightly. This undoubtedly showed that it was indeed as he'd thought. Even if this world wasn't occupied by the Yen sect, so long as the creation spirits here acknowledged his Tao inheritance, then he wouldn't even have to cultivate it, and it would still be able to assist him in observing the Tao art. Although this world did not have the feeling of being connected to the top and bottom like when the Yen sect was under the rule of the Yen sect, and there might be a repetition in the future, this was undoubtedly a way to achieve the Tao. This meant that even if it was not occupied by the Yen sect, it could still help him to see the Tao. The Yen sect still occupied an important position in this world because the rules in this world were completely copied from the Yen sect's original set. This also deepened the sense of recognition of the people. If there was no Yen sect first, then there would be no reference for Chen Xiaoting's actions, and there would be a layer of separation. He could not help but think that if the Yen sect and this method of imparting Tao worked together, then the effect would be much more than before. It was just that this place might require his incarnation to go. If it was a disciple, it would also be effective, but there would undoubtedly be more estrangement from the world than before. Obviously, this kind of Tao of the missing Tao required Vedanta to stoop down and personally search for it in the mortal world. With this thought, he already had a plan in his heart. If he came down and found such a place again, if the Tao of the spirit of creation was still the mainstream, then he should consider using this method. Among them, the one that could be guided the most was the incarnation of the spirits of creation. In the eyes of those who worshipped the Tao of the spirit of creation, they were the closest to the Tao. However, in his eyes, the more this kind of person was oppressed, the more they wanted to get rid of the shackles. If he could use it well, it would not be inferior to the merit of imparting Tao. Therefore, he made up his mind and allowed the incarnation to stay in the mortal world, while his original body continued to search for the land of creation. However, he did not think that this method would be carried out without any twists and turns. Not to mention other things, if the Wali, the spirits of creation, saw that he occupied more and more of the missing Tao, they would most likely come out to obstruct him. Thinking of this, he looked at the place where the calamity power gathered, and his gaze became a little deeper. Or, it was not just the spirits of creation. In the blink of an eye, another dozen years passed, and the world where Qin was became more and more stable. However, ever since he knew that the cultivators who cultivated the Tao of the spirit of creation were not the ones he had seen, he was also extremely uneasy. He was afraid that such people would come to him, so he pleaded with Zhang Yan to build a realm gate in his own world to communicate with the Yan sect so that they could help each other. Zhang Yan did not refuse. In reality, doing so would allow the spirits of creation to acknowledge him even more deeply. In reality, there were still many people in this world who worshipped the Tao of the spirit of creation, but it was not worth bothering about. He did not need the Wali to intervene, as it was impossible to make all the spirits of creation lean towards him. Even the spirits of creation could not do it, so it was enough for him to have such a situation. And just as he was looking for the next land of creation, he suddenly opened his eyes and saw that there was a Wali seeping out from the cracks in the void, and it was coming towards Bushutian. He felt a sense of familiarity from it, and his heart moved slightly, but he did not stop it. There was some strange movement in the sky, and there was obviously a consciousness that was inviting him. His eyes flashed slightly, as expected, it came. But unexpectedly, before the spirits of creation could react, it was the great virtue in the calamity power that acted first. He thought for a moment and sent a strand of consciousness into the prison world's sky. In a flash, he was inside the sky and saw the Taoist from last time standing there. The Taoist bowed and said, "Greetings, fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan returned the greeting and said, "Fellow Taoist, just now, you have the intention to invite me. What is it?" The Taoist said, "I came for fellow Taoist, and I hope that fellow Taoist can find the missing Tao." Zhang Yan said indifferently, "Why? I am searching for my own Tao, what does it have to do with you all?" The Taoist said in a deep voice, "What fellow Taoist is doing now is getting closer to the missing Tao. If this continues, the spirit of creation will have to use other methods to suppress fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan glanced at him and said, "I am looking for the method buried by the spirit of creation, so if he wants to make a move on me, it will be perfect. Moreover, if I force him to make a move, wouldn't that be a good thing?" The Taoist said, "Every action of the spirit of creation involves the overall situation. He is scheming against me, and I am scheming against him. Pulling one hair will affect the whole situation. Although fellow Taoists' actions can mess up his plans, it will also cause us to lose our plans. Thus, I have come to advise fellow Taoists to stay calm for now and wait for the overall situation." Zhang Yan was deep in thought. According to what the Taoist said, it was nothing more than saying that his actions had increased many variables. From this, it could be deduced that the battle was carried out according to certain rules. These rules might not be set by both sides, and it was very likely that they had no choice but to do so. However, since the conflict between both sides was actually irreconcilable, one side would definitely fall. Thus, it was still the same saying, victory and defeat could not be seen until the end. He looked at the Taoist and said indifferently, "Everyone has their own plans, and I also have my own plans. We are both people who seek the Tao, so why should I bend myself to follow others? I'm afraid it will be difficult to convince me with just fellow Taoists' words. The Taoist wanted him to follow the overall situation, but didn't clearly state what he was going to do. This was unable to convince him. In other words, he clearly had the ability to control the overall situation, but the Taoist wanted him to completely follow the overall situation and didn't want him to know the inside story. How could this be possible? Moreover, when facing a great enemy like the spirit of creation, it was impossible to win his trust with just one person's words, and there was no way to prove that this wasn't the spirit of creation's arrangement. The Taoist was silent for a while before he said, I understand fellow Taoists' meaning, but this time, I am only communicating with my incarnation through some Weili. The spirit of creation is also watching from the side, so there are many things that are difficult to explain. Please wait for a while, fellow Taoist. It won't take long for you to understand everything.